There's a lot to the primary grade, but that's still just scratching the surface. We're moving on to the secondary grade now, and there's a lot more we can do in Resolve than just with the primary and there's a lot more to what we can do in Resolve than just the primary wheels. A secondary grade is an adjustment that targets a specific region of the image based on a number of factors that we call qualifications. This essentially means selections, but we're going to use the correct terminology throughout this course. A qualification sets out a series of criteria, and then only selects the pixels which meet those criteria, hence qualify. I could say for this node, I wanted to work on bright, saturated green pixels. The qualifications I set out would be the hue, green, and the saturation, medium to high. I would then only work with the pixels that qualify and meet all the criteria I've set out. We can also make qualifications with the power windows, which allow us to make shapes to work inside of or outside of. We can even combine qualifications and make some really accurate selections in our image. Secondary grading is where the bulk of the work is done to stylize an image. If you want a cool thriller look like Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, or something a little more out there like Mad Max Fury Road, then you're going to have to dig into the secondary tools and make those accurate adjustments to reach that point. In this module, we're going to cover all of the secondary tools within Resolve, and then go through a short sequence using them. Click on through to the next lecture when you're ready. Okay, one more scope, then that's it, for a while at least. With Resolve version 16, the histogram scopes have become more relevant, and Resolve can now overlay histograms on top of certain tools to give us more information whilst working. Because of this, we're going to have a very quick overview of how to read the histograms. Put simply, a histogram is a graph showing two values. Across the x-axis is the value for a particular attribute. In the case of Resolve, it's usually red, green, blue, or brightness. And the y-axis gives us frequency, or the number of pixels that have specific values. For example, this histogram shows us that we have a lot of pixels here with very low red, green, and blue values. On the left, we have very low values, hence darker pixels. And then the y-axis, the higher this goes, the more pixels we have with this value. And you can see here we have a very high reading on the left-hand side, and you can see that that's reflected in the image here with this lad, because we have a lot of very dark background. The dark pixels back here are what's making this very big reading on the left-hand side. We have a lot of pixels with very low RGB values. Now, I've never found these particularly useful before now, but with Resolve 16's new histogram overlays, and you can see this here on the RGB curve, they're actually becoming quite useful monitoring tools. So we'll take a look at the histogram settings, and then that will be it, because we're going to go over the specifics of the histogram overlay in the next lecture. I really have two settings here. I have RGB or YRGB. RGB will give me a separate histogram for the red, green, and blue values in my image, and YRGB will give me yet another histogram, a grey one up here, and that just shows the brightness values in our image, that's all. Remember that the higher the reading on a histogram, the more pixels have the value indicated at that point on the x-axis. So, near 0, near absolute black, the darker values, we have a lot of pixels with low values. That's what we can see on these histograms here. Now, that's actually it. I told you this would be a quick one, but it's good to have a basic understanding before we look at the overlays in the next lecture. We'll take a look at our first secondary tools in the next lecture, so click on through once you're ready. Okay, so in this video, we're going to start taking a look at some of the real secondary tools within DaVinci Resolve. And we're going to focus on the most simple tools to use, and they are the secondary curves. We're going to cover the first 3 secondary curves in this video. So to get started, I've performed a very simple primary grade on this clip, and now I want to start looking at a secondary grade. Now, as a general rule of thumb, when we make a secondary color adjustment, we want to make a new node, which is Alt or Option and S, in order to make a new serial node. You can see I've already done that on the node tree up here. So, first let's expose the attribute curves, or one of the attribute curves. First, we want to click on the curve icon. We might not have the curves already exposed down here. So if we have a different window in this central lower space here, then we want to click on this curve icon. And by default, the RGB curves that we worked with on the previous video will be exposed. In the upper right of this small window, we have a series of icons up here. These used to be little white dots. And these allow us to select the different secondary curves that we can use within Resolve, with the leftmost being the standard custom curve, the RGB curve. So I'm going to click on the next icon along, which is kind of two little rings, and this is the hue versus hue curve. So what does this do and why would we use it? The hue versus hue curve allows me to take control of the color of some pixels and change them. I can say I want to qualify or select the blue pixels in this image, and I will explain exactly what I'm doing here in a second. I can make all of those blue pixels into green, for example, or purple or cyan or even red or orange if I wanted to go extreme. And this is the purpose of the hue versus hue curve. It allows us to very quickly make more general adjustments to the overall color of different pixels within the image. Now, we've taken a look at what it can do. Let's actually take a real look here at the interface and how to use it properly. First, if I want to get a proper closer look at this, I can hit these little outward facing arrows and this will pop out into a hovering window. And I'm just going to work on this hovering window because it's easier for you to see. Obviously, it's bigger on the screen. So what I have here is a graph showing the color spectrum and a straight line and also a histogram. Just ignore the histogram for now. We're just going to talk about the line and the kind of rainbow spectrum that we can see. So let's use our previous operation as an example. I can draw a curve out of this straight line, and I can use that to change the hue of pixels from blue or cyan to green. So what's the logic behind this? Well, the horizontal position on this graph is the hue that I am choosing to work with, is the original color, according to this node, that I want to change. So I can place these points by left-clicking, just like I can on the custom curves in the previous video. So I left-click here, and I left-click here. And then I can left-click and drag in between, and I draw a curve. And now this curve is saying all the hues between these 2 points will change, will be rotated, is the correct term, according to how I move this point and draw this curve. So now I can say, right, I've gotten hold of all the blue pixels in this image, I will drag them up, and that will make them green. Or I can drag this point down, and that will make them purple. Now, you may wonder what exactly is happening, what is the logic behind changing the colours here. So let's quickly go over how we can read the change we're making, and to do that we have to use our vector scope. So I've got our vector scope here, and I'm just going to increase the visibility, and I'm going to zoom in so it becomes easier for us to see. So we understand how to read the vector scope by now. We know it reads hue versus saturation and does not give us any position information. And the blue reading is super obvious down here. It's this big long spike between blue and cyan. So it's going to be very easy for us to see the change we're making with this example. If I click this dot here and I drag upwards, it makes, look at that, it makes the blue signal rotate clockwise around the vector scope. It rotates the hue. And I can then see it rotating around until it reaches the green target or gets closer to the green target, and it then becomes green. Conversely, if I drag this point downwards, it rotates counterclockwise and becomes magenta. So this is what we're doing. We're basically grabbing the reading on the vector scope and we're moving it around the circle towards a new target and therefore a new color. And it's super easy to use the curve. It's literally just click, click, define our working area, then click and drag up or click and drag down. And we actually have a set of shortcuts on the lower left down here, these what are called 6-vector targets, that will allow us to easily select all of the main colours on the spectrum: red, yellow, green, cyan, blue and magenta. So if I want to work with blue, I can just click the blue target, and lo and behold, it places 3 points down on my straight line, and I can then move these around to start working on those pixels. So this is what the hue versus hue curve does. It lets us change one colour into another. Now, why would we use that? What's the point? It's actually a really powerful tool for getting skin tones in the right place very, very quickly. Because as we can see, if we take a closer look at this image, most of my warm colours are within the skin tones. There's a little bit in the kind of, I think it's a carp painted on the back here, but mostly it's within Wayne's skin tones here. His name is Wayne, I don't think I've mentioned that before. And the dealer, which is the character's name, her skin tones here, she's a bit more yellow. So what we can do is we can drag or we can click to highlight the warmer colours, and this is really annoying. Red is right on the edge of the graph and kind of loops around to the other side, and red is what I find I work with the most in the hue versus hue curve because I mainly do use it to tweak skin tones. And I can change the skin tone colour, and it's a bit more tan between red and yellow. I can change the skin tone colour should I want to. Now obviously I'm not going to make it green, but for demonstration purposes. And you can see, if you keep an eye on the vector scope, you can see what's happening here. So I can just drag it a little bit closer to the eye line. If I go into my vector scope and let's show the skin tone indicator, there we go. What I could do is I could drag it just a little bit closer to the eye line, towards that kind of mythical, imaginary, ideal skin tone. And there, that's just made it a little bit more balanced. Now, clicking and dragging and making very small adjustments is difficult. The point on the graph you have selected has a black core. And then we have input hue and hue rotate in the lower right, down here. Input hue, if I click and drag, will move the selected point left or right. And hue rotate, left or right, will move it up or down. So this is actually how I make very accurate adjustments using the hue versus hue curve. And there we go, I've got a basic secondary skin tone adjustment, and it's slight, but you can see he's a little bit oranger, a little bit more yellow there, and a little bit red, a little bit more healthy looking here. But this is only one of the adjustments that I want to make. And to do that, we're going to have to move on to the next curve. So I've closed down my pop-out window, and now I'm going to hit the next icon along, which is the ring and the water drop. And this is hue versus saturation. Now, it looks identical, and it will do because we've not done anything with it yet. And now we might want to start thinking about what does this histogram mean? Because hue versus saturation makes the impact of the histogram quite obvious. I'm just going to pop out again for the sake of demonstration. You don't need to pop this out whenever you use it. So I now want to change the saturation of the skin tones, but first let's give a little demonstration of the hue versus saturation curve, and let's just talk about what the histogram we're seeing means. Now, we know what a histogram is. It's just value and frequency. The higher the spike, the more pixels of a particular value we have, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. This high spike on my secondary curve tells me I have loads and loads and loads of pixels which are this hue, because it's a big spike on the bluish cyan part of the spectrum, and lo and behold, I can look into my background and look, it's telling me that this wall is A, there's a lot of it, and B, that it's blue and cyan. So that checks out. I can gauge how much visible impact my corrections are going to have by essentially making selections or qualifications around the spikes on the histogram and then dragging up or down. Because if I do that, I'm working with a large number of pixels. and obviously the visible impact is going to be greater. So if I'm thinking, maybe this looks a little bit cool, maybe the blue's a little bit too strong, and I want to change that, well look, the ideal point for me to drag up or down is right on top of this spike here, because this is where the largest number of pixels have the relevant hue. Now, hue versus saturation, as the name implies, lets us qualify based on hue, and then change the saturation of the pixels. So I can now say, look, I've got a lot of very strong blue pixels. I can see from the vector scope they're quite saturated. I can see from the histogram that there's a lot of them. And obviously I can look at the image as well. And I'm thinking maybe this blue is a bit strong. So I'm going to grab here and drag down on top of this spike, and I'm just going to bring the blue down ever so slightly because I thought maybe it was getting a bit distracting in the background down there. And that's how we use hue versus saturation. We say this color is a bit strong, or this color is a bit weak. I want it to get stronger, or I want it to get weaker. And in order to do that, I place these points around the hue I want to change, and then I drag up to make it more colorful, or I drag down to make it less colorful and less saturated. So now I've made a hue versus hue tweak to my skin, and I want to increase the saturation of the skin. I can make more than one adjustment to hue on the same curve. I don't need to make a second node and make a new and start with a new curve. I can now just go ahead and I can make my skin tone adjustment here, and the same curve can work on the blues and on the reds. That's absolutely fine. I just need to make sure I define my different working ranges with these points in an appropriate fashion. So now I'm going to take this down here, and what I can do is I can drag up on the warm colours, and look, I'm making the skin more saturated, or I can make it grey, and I'm just going to drag this up until I'm happy with the way the skin is looking. And lo and behold, I like that phrase a lot today, we now have, if I toggle off and on, a secondary adjustment making the skin much brighter, healthier, and much more fitting with the piece, much more appealing to look at. So that would be a fairly typical practical application of the hue versus sat and the hue versus hue curves. We're going to take a look at the third curve because these are all essentially hue versus something else curves, unlike the last three, which we'll cover a bit later. I'm going to take a look at the final curve now, and we're almost done, don't worry. And this is hue versus luma, and it's had a bad reputation ever since it was first made, way back in Resolve 12 or something, I think. It used to just be hue v hue and hue v sat back in the olden days. But what hue versus luma does is, following the exact same logic, we can choose a hue to work with, and then we can actually make that hue brighter or darker. Luma is, of course, brightness. So hue versus luma is change brightness based on hue. I can say I want the blues to become brighter, but not more saturated, or darker and not more saturated. Now, I'm going to be completely frank with you. I almost never, ever use this curve. It was a bit of a lemon, to be honest with you. Back in the olden days, it was just not very good. It used to introduce all kinds of weird artifacting, and generally you try and minimize brightness adjustments or luma adjustments within a secondary qualification, because changing the luma or the brightness within a secondary qualification is the most likely thing to reveal the edges of your qualification and to reveal the edges of your secondary adjustment, and thus make your image look unnatural. You'll see exactly what I mean by that when we cover the HSL keyer in a later video, but for now, just kind of keep that logic in mind. Making things much brighter or much darker within a secondary qualification is generally something to avoid. You can do it in a limited capacity, but it's something you don't want to do too much of. So I don't really have an ideal use case for hue versus luma because I never use it. But it's a tool in Resolve, and I'm training you to use Resolve, so here's how it works. For example, if I want to change the skin, it just doesn't look right, you know. Because normally when I'm working with brightness, I want to take the existing contrast into account, and this curve doesn't really do that. It just works with hue, and then it's everything within that range, regardless of how bright it already is, gets the same adjustment, and it's just not a very natural way to work. There's not a lot of good fall off or anything like that within the kind of the contrast range we're working in. So I've rambled on long enough. This video is almost 20 minutes, whereas in the last version I think it was 7. But there's one last thing I want to make absolutely clear when using these curves, and that's that you want to make big, smooth, sweeping curves. You don't want to make a zigzag. So shapes like this are great, they're fine. What we have here is a smooth fall off. We have a gradual reduction of our adjustment rolling off as the hue value changes, and that's going to help hide the edges of our adjustment. What I do not want, and I'm just going to hit the reset button up here, is to make any adjustments which look like this. I don't want zigzags, I don't want issues like this, because what this is going to do is it's going to make very similar values very, very different, and when we do that, let's say we increase the visible or the visibility of noise in the image. Noise is that kind of dancing radio static kind of a look. So if I now play this clip, you'll see what I've got going on in the background there. Because what I've done is I've made very similar values very, very different, we get this kind of chattery dancing effect, because all of these pixels are very slightly different from each other anyway. And the more we exaggerate that through changing contrast, the more different we make them. And so the fact that they're slightly different becomes exaggerated, and then noise becomes much more visible. Noise is always there, it's just whether or not we make it visible is the whole kind of thing. So we do not want to make zigzags like this. We want nice, smooth curves. And if we want to get rid of a point, just right click. So this is the trick, nice, rolling, smooth curves on this interface. So go ahead and have a play around with these tools. Pick a clip, and I would say try and work with some very key visible colours. Skin tones are always a really good one for secondary curves, as well as maybe this background. Now, skin, grass and sky, foliage, these are all really good things to work on with the secondary curves. Work on the foliage in this shot, work on the skin in this shot. Try to work on the skin in this shot and see how you're not going to be able to work on this face independent from this wall. And this is an important learning point. This is spotting when we want to use the curves for general quick work, or when we need to use more advanced tools such as power windows and the keyer, which we're going to cover in our next videos. So go ahead and have a good play around with these tools, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay, so now we can move on to the next 3 attribute curves, which deal with luma and saturation, as opposed to hue. So we're going to take a look at what these curves do and why we might want to use them. So I've made a new node here just to help keep things clean, and as we said beforehand, the best way to handle your node tree is to kind of split your nodes up into goals. So I've got primary grade, basic, secondary, skin and background. In this one, I want to deal with problematic saturation. Okay, I'm going to deal with the kind of crazy out of control blue in the background here. So how are we going to do that? I'm going to go to the 4th icon along here, and that is the sunshine symbol and the raindrop, or the water droplet. And this is luma versus saturation. So I'm going to click the pop out just so you can see it. And let's just take a look at what we've got here. So I don't have the full spectrum of colours like I had before. On this one, I've just got black going through to white. And what this is showing us is we've got our dark values on the left and our bright values on the right. And we have the exact same histogram down here before. Now it's a different shape because it's charting a different value against frequency. This time it's brightness, not hue. So this is showing me I've got a lot of very, very black pixels here. Some very dark ones, then kind of middle dark, kind of, you know, maybe about 30% brightness here. And then the rest of the image is brighter, but it's not so concentrated. So we have quite a bright image with a lot of the dark values being quite kind of bunched together, and that's fairly typical, to be honest with you, with the way light falls and the way light behaves. So what can I do with this curve? Well, basically what this allows me to do is change the saturation of pixels based on how bright they are. And I'm just going to set up a little example, bear with me. So let's take a look at the saturation in my shadows. Now I've just made my shadows go green and they look weird and unnatural, but we're going to partially deal with this using the lum versus sat curve, because actually this one can be very useful and it's one I use a lot. One of the problems we have, and you'll see this later on with the HSL keyer when we cover it, is that our shadows contain pixels of almost every different colour, but they look black because they have a very low saturation. And that can cause problems. They can pick up odd colours and behave in weird ways. Sometimes you get little like red or blue dusty noisy bits in the shadows. Sometimes you end up picking up shadows in a qualification that you don't want to pick up because of this and all of this kind of thing. So lum versus saturation is quite useful in cleaning our shadows out, and I do use it quite a lot. What I will do is I've already start with a point at the left and the right here. So I just need to add one more point. I will add a point somewhere around here. And I can drag my leftmost point up, and you can see up here those green shadows are getting brighter. In fact, they're getting so bright I can begin to make out detail that was lost before. Or I can drag it down. And what you can see is that that green quality is actually being pulled out, and the shadows are going kind of charcoaly and a bit more black and neutral. So I can use this tool to keep any odd colour casts in my shadows under control. And this shape of curve that I'm drawing here, I do actually use this quite a lot. It's not normally this strong, but I do very often keep problematic shadows clean and neutral by doing this, and can help deal with odd little bits of colour cast or things that might get introduced when I'm working with the log wheels. So now we can see before our shadows are kind of green and look weird, and now we've taken that colour cast out. So that's one way to use this. It can be used to handle a colour cast in the shadows. It's always better to use your shadow wheel and midtone wheel to do that and get them neutral that way. But sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes the problem in the shadows has arisen from another operation you've performed, and then we come back to this and we use the lum versus sat curve to fix that. So that's the main real use case I have for this tool, is to keep colour casts in the shadows under control. The same can also be said, let's say we have some weird highlights. Maybe we shot with a colour cast and our highlights do that weird fluorescent yellow thing when we try and make the image neutral. We can bring our highlights down as well. Now in this image that's not going to do anything because the highlights here are fine, but if you have like a weird blue or yellow in what should be white highlights, or like a practical light can sometimes do that, then this tool can help you keep those under control as well. Just like in the previous curves, a kind of smooth rolling curve is what you're looking for. You don't want a zigzag, and you do usually kind of overshoot to get the effect you want. You want a lot of roll off, so you do often feel like you're overshooting with your working range when you set these points down. And a curve that looks like this, I've used this a lot, this kind of double-ended curve for kind of funny highlights or funny shadows, or if something was shot with bad colour balance or under weird artificial lighting, like in a club nightclub lighting. I do this quite a lot because there's all kinds of weird, wonderful colours going on there that don't play nice with camera sensors. So this is quite a good one for nightlife and that kind of footage. So this is essentially lum versus sat. I qualify based on luma, brightness, and then I change saturation, primarily used to keep your highlights and shadows in check. Whilst you can boost your midtones, there are far more precise ways of doing that, so I wouldn't recommend doing that with this curve. So now we'll take a look at the next one, and this is saturation versus saturation. Now that sounds really weird, but this curve is actually a real time saver. It can be very, very good. Let me just go back to the other curve and reset that. Saturation versus saturation. So if I go back to this previous node, and I will just, give me 1 second, I will saturate the daylights out of this blue, and then I will push global saturation up as well, just to make sure we really get the point. So obviously this is a terrible image and it doesn't look good. We're not going to deliver something that looks like this. It is just for demonstration purposes. But let's go back to sat versus sat so we can have a look at what we're dealing with here. Now again, that's the 2 raindrops, give us saturation versus saturation. So sat versus sat qualifies based on saturation and then lets us change saturation. And you're going to hear the phrase saturation so much that it's going to lose all meaning and just become a kind of mouth noise by the end of this lesson. But what this essentially means is we can take pixels which are very saturated and bring them down. And this is probably the key use case for this tool that I've found, is if something has gone crazy, if a particular material known for kind of misbehaving in front of the camera, say artificial fabrics, brightly coloured plastics, anything coloured with light shining through it, so stained glass, translucent plastics, even ears, earlobes, and the webbing between fingers held up to the sun can go kind of bright red or pink, then the sat versus sat curve can actually be very useful in bringing those things back under control. So let's just give an example of the saturation versus saturation. Obviously the blue has gone bananas here. Anyway, this blue has gone bananas here. So I want to make a curve which brings down the right hand side, and you can see on the vector scope that I'm bringing all the most saturated crazy bits back down under control. And if I drag it right down, you can see there it's having the impact on those colours. Skin tones can be quite bright and saturated. They're generally not the strongest colours in the image, despite being the most important. And so this curve can do quite a lot whilst sparing our skin tones, as we can see here. You know, if I'm working on like the right-hand side of this graph, I'm not doing a lot that's visible to these skin tones. And the skin tone colours which are being hit, you can see on the vector scope, are maybe the hoodie, the pink in the rose, the yellow in the centre of the rose or the flower back here, this pink paint in the right-hand side. So we can actually be quite sensitive to our skin tones whilst using this curve. And I just want to bring this down until that blue is sensible again. And that has the benefit of also bringing down other problematic colours that might be running amok as well. And this kind of shape, when dealing with the sat v sat curve, is very common. What you will notice is if I just make a kind of curve like this, we get this flat reading on the vector scope. And what that means is that where we should have a natural roll-off and variation in saturation, everything's becoming flattened. And when things get flattened like this, we lose contrast, we lose visible detail. So we want to avoid truncated and flattened signals like this. And that's why very often we make a curve this shape. And I appreciate it's hard to see white on white, but that's just the way that Resolve has made the UI here. That's very often why we make this shape on the curve here. So this is a fairly standard, bring the crazy colours back under control. This isn't a standard practice thing. This is something you elect to do situationally based on the colours you're dealing with. And children's toys, football shirts and sports uniforms, traffic cones, plastic cups and beakers, like just anything made of coloured plastic might need attention from this tool or from a HSL keyer later on. And it's generally what it's used for, is bringing those few outliers down. There's generally not a lot of need to bring the least saturated pixels up because of the issues with shadows containing all kinds of different colours that I've mentioned before. You end up getting shadows that have weird green, red and blue dots dancing around in them if you do this kind of operation on this curve. So don't bother doing that unless you really need to for some reason to make your footage stylized. So that's essentially it for sat v sat. When we get to middling saturation values, unless you want to give like a uniform boost and not upset things too much, what we can do is make a curve that looks more like this. and this can give a boost to our kind of low middling colours, but it's not going to make anything saturated go crazy. That's quite a common one as well. But outside of these, there's not a lot of use case for this tool. It's fairly specific. So we've had a look at Luma versus Sat and Sat versus Sat. Now we're going to look at the final curve, which is saturation versus Luma. And this one exists just because this is a combination of those variables, which is possible. I don't typically have a use case for this tool, just like with Hue versus Luma. I suspect it was designed and created because the others were, and you just had to switch the logic around a bit to do it, maybe. I don't know. I imagine software design is much more complicated than that. But because we had Luma versus Sat, we've also got Sat versus Luma. Now, Luma versus Sat qualifies based on Luma and changes the saturation of pixels based on how bright they are. Saturation versus Luma is the opposite. It qualifies based on saturation, and then it changes brightness based on how saturated those pixels are. I can use this tool to say, look, I want all of my least saturated pixels to get much brighter. And if I bring the left-hand side up, it's going to bring my highlights up and also my shadows, because my highlights and my shadows are typically the least saturated colors in the image. I don't know why you would do this. It's just like the Hue versus Luma. It introduces all kinds of noise. Well, it exacerbates noise and introduces all kinds of visible artifacting. I've never once used this curve in a grade that I delivered. I used to try and experiment with it a lot, thinking it's here, it must have a use, but I honestly don't see it. So I almost never use this curve, and I've never once made a point of using it in a project that I've delivered professionally. It just doesn't have a place in my toolbox, to be honest with you. So that's it with these curves. They're a bit more niche and a bit more situational. Luma versus saturation and Sat versus Sat can be very useful for highly specific problems, but you wouldn't necessarily use them in every single shot. It's just as and when you need to. Again, Sat versus Luma, Lord only knows. So go ahead and play around with your footage a little bit more. Just get a feel for these tools. I really would recommend getting a feel for Lum v Sat and Sat v Sat, because there's going to be a shot you hit in your own projects where you think, this is a highly specific problem. That one thing is going crazy, or my shadows, I just can't stop my shadows from going blue here. I can't get the wheels to do that for me. And then these curves they're gonna save you then. So make sure that you put some practice time in with these, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay. In this video, we're going to cover some use of the Color Warper tool. Now, there's a lot to this, so we're not going to cover all of it all at once. We're just going to cover the basic hue and saturation adjustments you can make with the Color Warper tool. So, by default, we may have our curves exposed. Over to the right, there's another icon, which is a hexagon with a load of dots in it. It looks like a spider's web. We're going to click that and reveal the Color Warper Hue Saturation tool, and we're going to stick with this one for now. Now I'll just reset it, make sure it's going to be what you see as well. So the Color Warper tool is a lot like having both the hue versus hue and hue versus saturation curves, secondary attribute curves, at the same time. It lets us change hue and saturation of pixels simultaneously, and it does that in a few ways of, let's say, varying levels of intuitiveness. It can be a bit difficult to get your head around this tool, but we're going to take a look at some basic use cases for it. So the first thing you'll notice is that it does look a lot like our vector scope on the right, but it's not the same, and that's because the Color Warper uses a variety of color spaces which we can switch between down here in the lower right, and none of them appear to be RGB. It will default to HSP, which I believe is Hue Saturation Perceived Brightness. We don't need to change this, and to be frank, the logic behind changing this gets very, very in-depth, and for these kinds of projects, it's not going to be necessary information. It's just going to be needlessly complicated to cover that right now. What this means is that what you see on your vector scope in your color warper will look a bit different from what you see on your vector scope to the right if you have it exposed. This is normal and not something to be particularly concerned about. It's just the way that this tool works. It uses a different, the way in which it interprets color and maps color is a little bit different. So let's start looking at how we might actually use this tool. I have this grid of points here, and if I click on a point and I move it, you may see that some colors begin to change, and you may also see how the reading on my vector scope to the right changes in real time as I move this point around. And you may be able to guess what's happening here. We are essentially picking up a part of our reading on the vector scope, and we're moving it around by clicking and dragging these points. So the point which is close to or underneath this point gets moved depending on how I drag this point around. And by doing this, I can rotate the hue and I can change the saturation in the same correction. I no longer need to use two separate tools to do this. Now you may be looking at this and thinking, well, it's a bit difficult to understand. Also, I've got these 6 points here. I can't seem to click and drag these lines. What's going on? So there are a few different ways in which we can use this tool. And one of the easiest ways is to make sure that we have the qualifier or the eyedropper active here on the lower left of the screen. We have a variety of tools, which we'll come back to later. And if we click the eyedropper, we'll have an eyedropper on the screen. And what I can do is I can actually just click in the screen on the color I want to use, and then I can drag it. And you'll notice the direction in which I drag this eyedropper tool is then mirrored in the color warper diagram down below. And this is the easiest way for me to use it. It's the easiest and most intuitive way for me to use this tool. I can then make my blue saturation hue adjustment. I can make it a kind of a juicy saturated cyan very, very quickly and with only one tool. And that's really the strength of the color warper. It's actually an extremely powerful tool, even if it does take a little while to get your head around. Now, you may be looking at this and thinking, well, yeah, but what we want to use is down here, and this dot is well, above this, and this doesn't seem very accurate to me if we don't have very many points to work with, and that's a good observation. In the lower left of the color warper interface, we have these drop downs, and these allow us to choose essentially the resolution of the color warper interface, how many different points we have to work with. And the more points we use, the more accurate the color warper is going to be. However, we do need to be careful in that if we have too many points and start to create too many hard boundaries on here, we will start to make visible artifacts. Generally, the warper is pretty good at avoiding artifacts, but with a lot of points, it can start to create them. I typically like to work at 12, a resolution of 12, and you'll see that gives me points right over the secondary colors between all of our key targets as well. So it's a good resolution to work with. Now, you can see I've got much more accurate control. I'm not hitting the shirt anymore. And I've really got good control over that blue color that I wanted to work with. So I now can just click and drag these things around, and that's a simple way to work with the color warper. However, there are some little rules that you need to be aware of, and I'm going to go back to a resolution of 6 here. Make sure you have this chain link active when you're changing your resolution, because the horizontal and vertical resolution of this hexagon can be changed independently. You can have more spokes, but fewer vertical points if you want. In actual fact, 12:6 is a pretty good way to work. Or you can make it the same. I like 12:12, you get a good degree of accuracy. However, for beginners, 12 on the first one and 6 on the second is probably the easiest way to learn to use this tool, in all fairness, so we'll stick with this for now. Now, there are some rules we need to be aware of here. You'll notice that most of these points are white, but the ones around the outside and the central point have a black border with a white core. This means that they are pinned, or locked. And you'll notice if I click and I drag a white point directly in the interface, not every other point moves. So let's talk about how this logic works, what exactly is going on here. Any point with a black border, any pin, will not move when nearby points move as well. You'll see the center and the outside, they're not moving. And also, if we imagine this is a bicycle wheel, we have the vertical columns reaching from the center outwards. We'll call these spokes. If I drag a point, only the points on that same spoke will move. You'll see only on this line, going from the center to the outside, only the points on this line going outwards move. The adjacent ones do not move, and that is by design. That's to stop us from really messing everything up with a single adjustment. So, the black pins won't move if points nearby them do move, and only the points in the same spoke or column will move as well. And this makes the tool much easier to use. Once I have changed or moved a point, it then gains a black border and becomes a pin. So if I move a point and then move an adjacent point, you'll see it doesn't move. And I can start to get some really weird effects by introducing some very high hue contrast in similar values here. So once we've moved a point, it no longer moves if we move an adjacent point. We have to click on it and move it again. We can click on and move any pin, and they will move adjacent points. But once a point becomes a pin, moving anything nearby it, or moving anything next to it, won't cause it to move anymore. And this is just so that we don't end up immediately undoing any adjustment that we've just made. So it's quite a logical way to approach this. So this is the basic way of using the color warper. It's hue and saturation at the same time. We have a whole bevy of tools over here that become very complicated very quickly, and I'm really not going to go into that much detail right now because it's just too much for this early on in the course. It really, really is. So there are a few more tips and tricks for making very basic use of the color warper, which we'll just quickly look at. We know that we can click on the picture and see, but what I can also do is I can hold Alt and I can click a point on the chart. And if I'm holding Alt, whilst I hold down the left click, it shows me which pixels will be affected if I move this target, or if I move this point, I should say. So doing this, I can quite easily figure out which of these, if I just hold Alt and click, and if I don't move it, it won't turn into a pin, so that's fine. Which of these tools, or which of these points, best isolate the hues I want to work with. So let's say I want to work with the skin. Well, it would be these two here, because the skin at the moment is a little bit on the yellow side. So now if I want to make an adjustment to the skin, I just hold Alt and click to say, okay, this will show me the skin, and now I'll just go, and I'll push the skin upwards, and I'm going to put my eye line back on again. Maybe put my graticule visibility up. And I'll just nudge things a little bit closer to the eye line skin tone, and now you can see on the same node I've made my hue saturation adjustment to the skin with one tool. Didn't need to use two curves, did not need to use a HSL keyer, which we'll obviously be using later on. So this can be a very, very powerful tool, and at a kind of resolution of 12, the fall off is naturally very good. It generally tends to avoid artifacting and visible problems. That is, unless we start to go crazy and we start to, drag the points beyond each other. And that's possible and perfectly valid in some cases to make an adjustment like this, but only if we're doing very strong stylized stuff, and obviously never to skin tones. If I wanted to make the background green, for example, I could make an adjustment like this, and you'll see that the fall off on that, there's no real artifacting visible. It's fairly good, and if we watch it in motion, there's a little bit of a blue halo around the edge here and the arm, so we just want to watch out for that, I guess. But it is generally pretty powerful. So We want to keep it simple with this tool for now. This really is as much as I want to cover because it goes very, very deep and it can get to be very, very advanced, which I don't want to do right now in the course. So have a play around with this. Use it to make the same basic adjustments you were doing beforehand. Use it to make hue and saturation adjustments to the skin. Use it to make hue and saturation adjustments to the background, to foliage and what have you, and just get a feel for it and get your eye in. And once you've done that, click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We're going to look at the Chroma Warper, a new tool that allows us to make smooth hue and saturation adjustments with a single operation. It's not unlike being able to use both the hue v hue and the hue versus sat curves at the same time. Now I won't sugarcoat this. It can be a difficult tool to develop a feel for, but it does have some value, and I find for quite specific tasks. We've got two new clips to practice with here. This is because they have very distinct colours and are good to practice on with tools that target hue. We will return to the previous short sequence after both of our lectures on the Chroma Warper. Now the Chroma Warper is accessible from the Colour Warper window. You access that by clicking on the spider's web icon down here. We now default to the new Chroma Warper. If we want to go back to the old Colour Warpers, we need to click either the hexagon or the grid back here. And then if we've done that, on the little triangle or cone icon here. It is worth mentioning that you can use either the Chroma or Colour Warper on a single node, but not both at the same time. If you want to use both tools, you need to split that operation up across at least two nodes. Right, so let's take a closer look at all of this. I've got a shot here, and I want to do some work on the foliage in the background. It's an off color, it's too yellow. And I also want to work on the red cap here. I want to do this without pulling any time-consuming secondary keys. I'm going to want to make hue and saturation adjustments. So we will start with the foliage. The Chroma Warper has two modes, normal and point to point. The default is, unsurprisingly, normal. This lets us take a group of target hue and saturation values and change their hue and saturation smoothly. Let's look at how this works. Before we start, we want to enable a particular setting that makes it much easier to understand what we are doing. In the three dots here, click and then go to Scope and make sure you have Output selected. This will make sense in a moment. We're going to fix the foliage with this adjustment. I want to grab this yellow-green value and change it to a greener green and keep the saturation in check. Now, down below, notice we have a similar reading to the vector scope. This is the chromaticity diagram, and it's a lot like the vector scope. The further the reading reaches towards the edge, the more saturated it is, and the direction it's pointing in is the hue. What I can do is I can click and I can drag the white signal around and push it so that it lands in a different place on the diagram down here, thus changing both its hue and saturation. This is called a stroke, and it produces two dots, a line, and an area of effect indicator called the chroma range on the chromaticity diagram. It lets us easily see how we are changing the colours of our image. I'm essentially grabbing everything within the chroma range of my initial click and moving it across the chromaticity diagram. The diagram only shows hue and saturation, so we are qualifying based on hue and saturation when using this tool. So I'm going to reset what I've done by hitting the reset switch up here, and let's take a look at the foliage. Now using this diagram, I can easily feel out where the yellowish part of our reading needs to land in order to look like a convincing green for our foliage. And by checking along with the image in the viewer, I can dial it in. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to drag it down. And there we are to the right. And we can drag down there. So now we can see the before and the after. We've got a much more convincing color for our foliage now. So I will do this again and I will show you the second and perhaps easier way to interface with this tool. I'm just going to hit the reset button again. If I mouse around in the viewer up here, notice there's an orange crosshair in the chromaticity diagram below. This is showing us the hue and saturation value of the pixel underneath the cursor. And if I click on this pixel and start to drag, look what's happening. It's mirroring the movement of my cursor on the diagram below. So I can actually click and drag the hue and saturation within my image around. So now I can drag it down and to the right a little bit. And I can fix my foliage that way. The benefit of doing this is that it takes the guesswork out of targeting the color you want to work with. Now, I've hit most of the relevant values here, but if I hit this icon, I can pop the scope up and out. You can see I've got some very saturated parts of my signal down here, still haven't been moved that much. So I want to tweak this and dial it in. I can actually put any number of strokes down here on the diagram. So now that I've made my initial stroke, I can make a second one, and I can just push it down there to bring it back and align it with the new signal I've made with the chroma warper. And now I've got all of my foliage in quite a good place down here. So here I have the finished correction addressing the yellow hue in the foliage. Now if I want to tweak these strokes, I can do that. I can click the cursor icon here and just left click to select a stroke and drag either of the dots around. I can change it after the fact. Very, very easily. And I can even add new ones as well. Let's say I want to move these values around down here. Maybe there's a few very saturated yellow values that we weren't hitting beforehand, although this is going to start hitting the skin, this correction. So I maybe won't do that one. If I want to get rid of an individual stroke, I highlight it and hit the trash can. So combining both methods of interacting with the chroma warper tends to yield the best results. So I've fixed the foliage for now. I can close this. I'm now going to take a look at the hat. When working on the hat, we'll take a look at the point-to-point mode. I want to change the color of the red cap here, but it's a big adjustment. Point-to-point is like picking up a part of your signal down here and then dropping it somewhere else instead of just pushing it. The intention here is to allow for significant color changes, for example, changing a blue shirt to yellow. In practice, it really only works with very distinct colors. So let's try to work on the cap here. I'm going to hit this icon, which means that now we're going to be working in point-to-point mode and not in normal mode. And I can grab hold of the hat, and I can move it anywhere I want within the spectrum and change its color entirely. Now we obviously have problems here. I'm not getting the less saturated values of the hat. So let's say for argument's sake, I want to make it more kind of magenta. Now I'm not hitting the values I want here, and we can see we've got problems with this qualification and we need to refine it. And we'll do that in the next lecture. But before we move on, I'd like you to play around in normal mode on a few shots. This tool is awkward at first, and it takes time to develop a feel for it. Click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay, here we are in the second video on the chroma warper. So we have a problem. We need to refine our qualification. We only want to work on the hat here, but we're not getting all of it. So let's take a look at what can be done. First, the chroma range slider. This allows us to expand or contract our qualification down on the chromaticity diagram down here. Dragging it to the right expands it, and dragging it to the left contracts it. I'm going to have to expand this qualification a great deal. Now look at what's happened. We're hitting our skin tones as well. We need to be able to exclude them from the qualification. And luckily, we've got the right tool for that, pins. I'm just going to bring my chroma range down a little here, as it will make it easier to understand what the pins are doing. Now, pins in the chroma warper do the exact same thing as pins in the color warper. They fix parts of our signal on the diagram in place, effectively excluding the pinned hue and saturation values from our qualification. This sounds like exactly what we need, so Let's hit the pin button down here, and we'll just left click on the diagram to place them. I'm going to need probably around 3. And I can hit the cursor, and each pin has its own chroma range. And I'm looking to expand it so that these circles encompass the skin tones down here, but don't quite hit the red hat. So I might need another 1 down here. And now I will select my stroke again. And when I bring chroma range up, you can see we can hit the hat, but we've done a much better job of protecting the skin. I might add another 1 up here. Now you may well ask why we wouldn't just key something as distinct as this hat out, and in the real world we would. Point-to-point is situationally useful. Granted, it's a new tool, but I haven't found a lot of use for it outside of tweaking very distinct objects or pieces of clothing. So I'm going to reset this as it's not a very good looking correction here. I also want to show you how to preserve our neutral colors whilst using this tool. It's quite simple, but also very important, as we won't be working with super saturated colors most of the time. In this new shot, we want to fix the blues on the wall. They're the wrong color. But if I just go back into normal mode and grab and drag, you'll see that the shirt and the white text on the wall begin to be tainted blue. Now all we want to do to fix this is put a pin down in this white circle near the center of the diagram. These are where our neutral values are. And then we can bring the chroma range down a little. And now I'm going to delete this stroke. Now, when I click and drag, I can work on these blues, but I'm leaving all of my neutrals alone. So you see, even if when I make it very extreme, we're not hitting the neutrals. So I'm just going to fix the hue and saturation here. Very, very quick and easy way to do this. Placing a pin down in this little white circle is a very, very good trick. It makes sure that we're not going to interfere with our highlights accidentally when we do this. Highlights typically tend to be more neutral, so when we use this tool, we can tint them different colors. We want to avoid doing that. So back to our first shot. Get on the right node. I want to do some work on the skin tones. And here we'll take a look at our exposure controls. Exposure, unsurprisingly, allows us to change the brightness of our qualified pixels. So first, let's do a little bit of work on the skin. I'm just going to eyedropper and drag, and it's a touch yellow, so I'll put it a little bit closer towards red-orange and a little bit more saturated. Now I don't want it to go pink, and I'm obviously not getting all of the colors I want to work with here. So let's pop this out and do a little bit more work. I'm going to change, there we go. I want to work with the more saturated skin colors. I don't want to go crazy. I'm going to bring my chroma range down a little bit. I don't want to hit the kind of very out there colors. And I am going to pin my neutrals as well, just so I don't end up accidentally tinting those highlights. Just a very slight nudge. There. So it's made a small but important difference to the saturation and hue of our active skin tones there. Now we're going to look at exposure. So this, unsurprisingly, lets us brighten or darken our image, and is constrained to the values within the qualification on the chroma warper. You have to be careful with this. Making luma adjustments within a secondary is the fastest way to give it away and ruin the shot, even though I keep saying that, and I'm constantly doing this in front of you. It's a common operation, but it's still the most risky one. I mostly don't use exposure a great deal, but it can be useful, so let's take a look. I've already made the stroke when I fixed the hue and saturation, so now I can drag the exposure down just a little bit. Add a little bit more drama, a little bit more depth to these skin tones, and I might actually increase my chroma range to reduce visible noise here. And now before and after. We are also beginning to hit the foliage, so I'm going to need to put some pins down here. And I think I might expand here because I'm introducing a halo up here, which is about there, so I'm going to need to put the pins. There we go, that's got rid of the halo in the foliage. And that's given a bit more kind of depth and interest to the skin tones by adding a bit of contrast here. So that's the general exposure setting. Let's now take a look at the tonal range high and tonal range low settings. We've got a few options to refine this, and they impact which part of the tonal range our exposure slider impacts. Tonal range high and low both default to 100. And as I reduce this, you'll see the impact of the exposure operation here on the shadows and the undertones diminishes. The darker pixels in this actor's skin get brighter because they're now being excluded from the exposure adjustment. And likewise with the tonal range high, we can see that as I bring this down, the highlights come back and get a bit brighter. Maybe that's better, so let's bring tonal range high down. And this is pushing the highlights out of our exposure adjustment on this node, or within the chroma warper. So I can bring this down and we keep our highlights, but we keep the kind of darker undertones, which adds a bit more contrast. So I will leave that there. I think that looks good. And finally, pivot is a lot like contrast pivot in the primary wheels. It dictates where the split between the low and high values is. I can drag this up to increase the part of the tonal range considered to be low by the tool, and to the left to increase the part of the tonal range considered to be bright by the tool. Not very visible in this qualification. I've not used it a great deal in practice, I'll be honest with you. So, we've had a good overview of the chroma warper. It's still new, and I feel it's difficult to be really precise with it. It uses a very wide area of effect by default, which I still find awkward. But practice makes perfect, and it is handy to adjust very distinct objects very quickly. Have a play around with these clips, and click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We're going to look at the HSL, or Hue, Saturation, Luma keyer, one of the most powerful tools within Resolve, and we're going to look at how to pull keys by using the manual controls and also the eyedropper as well. The HSL keyer allows us to qualify based on hue, saturation, and luma. I can tell Resolve that for this node, I just want to work with bright, highly saturated red pixels, or dark, low saturation blue pixels. In this shot, let's say I want to work with the foliage in the background, so I can tell Resolve that I want to work with green pixels of both medium and high brightness and saturation. This allows us to make extremely powerful, targeted adjustments to regions of the image based on the colors within. It can also be used in conjunction with our other secondary qualification tools in order to make very accurate qualifications. So let's review the controls first, and we will go back to this gradient in order to do that. So the first thing we want to do is expose the keyer controls. We do that by clicking the eyedropper down here. And these three bars, the HSL keyer, this is what we're looking for. So let's take a look at the first of these three bars. This is hue. And we all know what hue is by now, the actual color, red, green, yellow, etc. This bar allows us to tell Resolve what colors we want to work with for this node. We have a width setting. And as I drag it to the left, you can see that these two bounds down here come in to describe a box that gets smaller as I drag to the left and bigger as I drag to the right. Everything within this box inside these two black lines is qualified, and everything outside is disqualified. And on any given node, we only work with the qualified pixels. So we have a width setting. Now I want to place this box around the green hues, and width alone isn't going to do that. So we also have center, and I can drag center to the right to move the box to the right, or center to the left to move the box to the left. So I will move this box and drop it over the green values and bring the width in, just so I don't get yellows or cyans as well. Now, at this point we want to review our key. We can't just guess as we're doing this. So I want to go up to the upper left of the viewer window, and I want to hit the highlight icon, this kind of two semicircles on a stripy background up here. When I do that, I'm going to see everything that I've qualified is going to be visible, and everything that is outside of the qualification is going to be grayed out, neutral gray. And also, look at what has happened to the vector scope. What you'll notice is we're kind of cutting a triangular pizza slice out of the vector scope. As I bring out width, it will increase in size, and I can make it thinner as well. Keep the idea of this shape in your head. It can make learning to qualify things much easier when you're first starting out. Essentially, we're drawing a shape on the vector scope that contains the values that we want to work with. Now I've got center and I've got width, but I've got some very hard edges on this qualification, which generally speaking is no good. I've also got soft. Now as I drag soft out, you can see we have these two triangular elements of our box which come out, and these show us the fall off of our qualification. Anything inside the box is qualified, anything outside the box is disqualified, and anything within a triangle is partially qualified. We'll have a kind of transparency up here in the key, with higher opacity towards the center and lower eventually to 0 towards the pointy end of the triangle. Now you can use these controls and drag them, but you can also click and drag the box in the bar as well. I just find it easier to use these controls because I've just been doing that for years now. So I don't want too many yellow values. And I've got one last control here. Let's say for argument's sake, I want to get rid of the yellow values on the right-hand side. I've got symmetry, and as I drag symmetry in, I can take the triangle away on one side or on the other. And in this case, I want to bring the triangle in on the yellow side just so I get fewer yellow values qualified. This is normally if we have one particular hue we just really want to avoid, but the feathering of or the soft of our qualification is making us hit it. Useful to be aware of, but you don't always use it. So we've got our hue qualification here. The next step is saturation. Now saturation is trickier to work with. It's very, very heavily weighted towards the left-hand side of this bar. We don't use the whole thing, not by a long shot. Now, saturation, and also luma for that matter, don't have width and center controls. They have low, high, low soft, and high soft. Low will bring up the left-hand side, and you'll see as we go down to black, black has a saturation value of 0. We're pushing the lower saturation values out of our qualification. And if I bring in high, nothing happens at first. It's because I have to bring high right down before it starts to push things out. We only really use this kind of, I don't know, left-hand 20% of the saturation bar in the HSL keyer. Now again, I've got hard edges, so I can add some soft. But before we jump right into that, look at what the low saturation range is doing to the shape in our vector scope. It's kind of cutting off the pointy part of the pizza slice. We're losing these low saturation values. So instead of a pizza slice, we now have a section of a ring on our vector scope, and everything within that section of a ring are the values that we're working with. Again, keep this shape on the vector scope in mind. Think about the shape you need to make on the vector scope to include the values that you want to work with, and we'll see how this works in a real shot a little bit later. Now, I've also got low soft and high soft. I'll bring high back in again. And you can see now I can make quite an accurate adjustment that works with a very specific range of hue and saturation values. If I click highlight again, anything I do on this node will only take place within the qualified region. I will go back to highlight. And now we have luminance. To better explain luminance, I'm going to reset saturation. Now, I've made a gradient that goes from full color down to black here. And the reason I did that is because it will go up to from full saturation down to 0 saturation, but black is also 0 brightness. So if I bring the low range up, and I have to bring it up a fair way, we'll start to push out the darker values. Now, generally speaking, darker values tend to have lower saturation. So often a combination of the low range on saturation and the low range on luminance can push any troublesome shadows out of our qualification, and we'll see that later on. But the controls down here are the same as saturation: low, high, low, soft, high, soft, and we can then compound that in with our saturation qualification controls and make a very specific shape here. So these are the general manual controls, and we can pull keys entirely manually. When I'm working on a control surface, I just do this out of force of habit. I like to just twiddle with the spinny knobs and just make a qualification this way. I don't even use eyedroppers most of the time. If it's a keyboard and mouse, I start with the eyedropper. So let's take a look at how we do that on a real shot. So the first things first, I want to make sure that I have a new and empty node, which I've already got up here. If we add a qualification to a node containing a primary grade, we will constrain that primary grade to the qualification we make, thus it will become a secondary and it won't hit the entire shot. So let's take a look at how we can get started with the eyedroppers. I've got a range of eyedropper tools down here, and by default the basic eyedropper is selected. Now I can go around and I can just click, left click and drag, and as long as I have highlight mode active, I will see the key that I'm pulling updated live in the viewer as I pull it. Now, the default eyedropper doesn't add. If I want to add more to this key, if I click again, it will start again. So I'll get started here. Next, we have subtractive. We'll do that in a second. We've now got an additive picker, and I can click, and that will add to the key that I've pulled. Notice that we've got some kind of reddish orange bokeh back here, and that's causing us to isolate the skin tones as well, which we don't want to do. The hair and the skin are getting pulled into this foliage key. So let's see if the subtractive eyedropper can help us. Not really. This is why I tend to get started with the default eyedropper and then dial it in with the manual controls, which is what we're going to do right now. I've got the start of a key, but if I play this, this is what we call chatter, and we're going to have to try and make a key that's more stable before we can use it. So I want to really look at the image. I can see some greens up here, some greens here. I don't want to make the shadows more colourful, and I don't want to hit the reds back here either. So I'm going to expand the greens, and I'm going to make it softer. As I'm softening this down, I'm hitting the hair, so I can bring symmetry in on the left-hand side to squeeze out the yellows. That's a good use case for symmetry. Expand width, push that out, and bring up the low saturation, and I can soften that out because it does help with the chatter a bit if we use a soft range. And now I think I'm going to just squeeze those shadows out as much as I can. Oh, that's high, not low. And now, still bits of chatter, but a much more stable and accurate key. What I can do now is I can add a bit more green to the foliage. Anything I do will only hit the key. And I just want to bring the greens in here out a little bit. Not too much, because it starts to look a bit goblin green otherwise. What I might do is I might push it into the highlights and then bring the saturation down. And now you can see we've just made a targeted adjustment to the foliage, making it pop a little more. Now, we've got a basic usable key. We've made a very mild adjustment, so the bits of chatter we have down here, they don't concern me too much. We can see a little bit of spill if I turn it off and on again. If I zoom right in, we can see the bits of green bokeh down here are getting more colourful. That doesn't bother me too much, and within the general kind of feel of this shot, I think that's acceptable. But I could go back in and I could bring low sat in a bit to exclude those values, clean up the key. Oops, keep missing. Terrible at FPS games. I miss everything. So now we've got quite a nice accurate key for the foliage, and we've made a slight adjustment to the green values within. So we've already seen the problem we have with chatter, and we still do have elements of chattering within this key. So we need to be able to fix that for more important colors. What we're going to do in the next lecture is we're going to key out the skin tones and the hair of this actor and make some adjustments within. But we're going to have to fix any chattering problems we come across. And to do that, we're going to use the matte finesse controls on the right-hand side down here. So first, have a bit of a play around with this shot, see what you can key, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We've pulled an easy key on something obvious and made a mild correction. Now we have to do something more challenging. We're going to pull a skin key, one of the most common operations in color grading, but also potentially one of the more challenging ones as well. It is very common, as the skin tones are often considered the most important colors in the image. We want to make these skin tones pop, so we'll have to qualify them first. Now, we can do this either way with the eyedropper or the manual controls. I'm going to do mine manually just because I'm used to doing that, so I'll put highlight on. The skin tones lie around red and yellow. They're in the orange part of the spectrum. And it looks like we're more towards yellow here, so I can just squeeze those tones out. Now we've got noisy shadows in here, very common. Shadows and very dark regions, they tend to contain pixels of more or less every hue at very low saturation. I've said this before. So what we can do is we can bring up our low saturation and low luminance in order to squeeze out the chattery bits. Now, a bit of a trick is to actually use left soft, or low soft, I should say, before we bring low up. Now the problem here is if we bring up low, we're going to start to get rid of the highlights on the hand, which I don't want, although we can fix that later on with the controls we're going to cover in this video. So now, let's see. Now this key isn't going to be perfect, which is what the matte finesse is about. Okay, so reasonably okay. We've got chatter, we've got noise, we've got a few bits we don't want over here, we've got things we need to fill in here. A good use case for the matte finesse controls. So if you have experience with green screen keying, you might recognize a number of the controls down here, but we're going to go through them all and why you might want to use them. So pre-filter. It's not always used. It's primarily for dealing with footage that is heavily compressed. Things like blocky artifacts, they can interfere with the key. If I pull this up, it's going to try and smooth out the colors before we key them. You can see as I drag this up, the blocky chattering gets a little bit better. And it's because it's just dealing with the compression inherent in the footage. So I can just bring that up a little bit if I think that helps. I might leave that at 0 and come back to that later on. Next is clean black. To understand this, we'll want to change the way we view our key. If I click on this icon down here, I can view the highlight in black and white mode, and what we're essentially seeing here is the alpha channel. Everything under a white pixel is qualified, is within our qualification. Everything under a black pixel is disqualified, is not in our qualification. What we want to try and do is get as solid a white shape as we can for the face and the skin tones, and get rid of all of the white noise in the darker regions. So we've got some white specks in the background. Keep an eye on those as I drag this slider up. You see how we're beginning to get rid of all those? So clean black takes white specks on a black background and fills them in with black and makes them disappear. It's used to get rid of little bits of the background that creep into the key. Now, we need to be careful with this because it can also eat into the edges of the key. Now, clean white, this is a lot like clean black, but it fills in small black gaps on a white background. If I drag clean white up, you'll see that our key becomes a lot more solid. But also, this stray region here, we're going to have to garbage map that out later, is getting more solid as well. So I'm going to bring key white up, try and get rid of the kind of black noise on the inside. Now next we have black and white clip. So, black clip. You might remember this one if you work with green screen. Black clip raises the value of what we consider to be black. If black is usually 0, then dragging the black clip up to 10 will tell Resolve that anything under 10% brightness should be considered pure black instead. It's a bit like bringing the black levels up on a histogram in Photoshop to increase the contrast of an image. If we have troublesome edges or areas of low opacity in our key that we want to eliminate, we can bring black clip up. What this is going to do is going to hit this greyish area here. It's going to hit parts of the hair as well. So if I bring up black clip, you can see that's getting kind of squeezed out. The hair, the chattery bits in the hair are also getting squeezed out as well. I think I want the hair to kind of be included in here, so I don't want black clip to go too far down this time. Then we have white clip. It works on much the same logic. If white is 100, then if we bring white clip down to 80, anything above 80 is considered pure white. It's going to make our grayer areas brighter and more solid. I need to be careful because I'll start picking up the noise in the background again. So I'm going to bring that down until I get a bit more out of the hair, but I don't want too much in the background. Well, actually, I'm not that bothered. I'll garbage map this out later. So now we can still see it's quite chattery and noisy, so we've still got some work to do, but the head is, or the face even, is much more solid. So next we have blur radius. Now, blur radius is the hero of matte finesse alongside noise reduction. This will blur the key, and we almost always want to blur the key to hide hard edges. Hard edges tend to make the shape of a qualification obvious, ergo we blur them out. We almost always use blur, and before we go any further, I'm going to go back to seeing the highlight mode normally, and then I'm going to drag this up a good healthy amount, although I do want to be careful of halos on the edge of the cheek there as I blur this out. You can see that as I blur, it's going to blur the inside and the outside of the shape. And if I blur it too much, I'm going to get a halo around the edge here. But the next tool can help us with that. I want to blur this here. And now we're going to move on to in-out ratio. In-out ratio is used to further refine our blur and tends to be used whenever we use blur, which is quite a lot. This setting lets us move the blur in and out of the edge of our initial key. It's kind of difficult to visualize from the description alone, so what we'll do is we'll zoom right in and we can take a look. I will crank up the blur, and you can see that now we've got the edge of the face and we've got a halo around it, and a bit of the inside is faded as well. So when we apply blur equally to the inside and outside of our key. If we make the I/O ratio negative, we apply the blur to the inner edge of the key. And what you'll see is that that halo comes in and we start to lose the inside edge of the key. And conversely, if I drag it up, it will expand the key outwards and we start to blur further and further outside. It starts to apply the entire blur just to this edge going outwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this back down to a sensible value, and then I'm going to drag in until I just about lose the edge bit of that halo. And that's going to make a nice, better edge for my key. So next we have morph operation. Now morph operation is a bit like applying a matte choker if you're familiar with green screen. We can use it to expand or contract the edges of our key. We can use it to either fill in little gaps in the middle of the key or even expand them outwards and make them bigger. We want to choose our morph operation for this. Now I've got lots of little gaps in here that want to be filled in. I've got kind of a gap on the nose, on the teeth, on the lips down here. I've got this highlight on the knuckle, all kinds of chattery nonsense in the hair. So where it says shrink, I'm going to choose closing, and this is going to start closing in these gaps. What I can do then is I can drag in the morph radius. It might take a little bit, but you see how all of those gaps within the key are now being filled in, and we've got a much stronger key here. The lips, the eyes, everything. It looks for holes surrounded, black gaps surrounded by white and tries to fill them in. I'm not going to get these bits of the hair in up here. In fact, they look as though they're quite saturated, so I might just tweak this. Ah, they're just very yellow. That was the problem there. That's fine. Now we can go back and we can tweak our other controls as much as we like. We don't have to start again or anything. So now we're getting a pretty solid key. Let's take a look. So bits of chatter around the edge. Now these very dark bits, yeah, we're not going to get those. I don't want to pull. Actually, no, we are going to get those. I tell a complete lie. We just need to garbage map these bits out. So bits of chatter, but we can fix those next. So we've also got shadow, midtone, and highlights. And what these do is they make the key more or less transparent. So more transparent if we drag to the left, more opaque if we drag to the right, in different parts of the tonal range within the qualified region. So if I drag shadows to the right, the shadows in our key are going to get more opaque. If I drag midtones to the left, our midtones are going to fade out. To the right, they're going to get boosted. And highlights to the left, the highlights will fade out, or to the right, they will get boosted again. I didn't have these controls when I first started to use HSL, so it took me a while to get a feel for these. In this case, I don't really need them that much. I might push shadows up. Well, if I do that, I get the stuff on the left, so I don't really need to use these for this key. But they can be useful, especially if we're having issues, highlights in the hair or shadows, which just aren't playing ball. We can use these sliders to attack parts of the key and make sure that it behaves. I might just put the morph radius up a touch more and make sure I get the lips there. Now finally, we have denoise. Now denoise is going to be our savior here, it always is. We drag up denoise and it attempts to calm down the chattering of the key. And now you can see we've got a much more stable edge. It can introduce some kind of halo issues if you're not careful with it, but it's a pretty good setting overall. About 35 should do it. Slight bits of chattering down there. But otherwise, look at that. We've got a pretty good stable key on here. Now all we really need is to garbage mat this stuff out on the left. And then we have post filter, which kind of blurs things out and smooths it all out even more afterwards as well. I can put that up just a little bit. And we've now got a pretty good solid key on the skin. So we've made a big difference to our initial key. And now anything I do will just be within the qualified region. You can see how accurate this is. It's not quite getting all of the little stray hairs, but it's getting a lot. Well, it's getting almost everything here. So we've got a very good, very accurate key we can work with here. The last step is to combine our key with a power window to cut out these little bits of shadow here. So I'm just going to go into a power window, power curve, and I'm just going to draw a very loose garbage mat around the face, and voila. We've now got our finished qualification on the skin tones for the actor here. Lighting was quite difficult. These highlights are a bit much, but then he was in shadow otherwise. I'm okay with pushing these to get his skin tones to be in a good place. We could maybe do something about those in a different node. So what we can do now is we can just push the saturation of the skin up slightly. We can warm it up. And just make a very slight push to the skin tones. But we've warmed them up and just brought a little bit more life into them there. And this is a very, very common kind of correction to make. Right, so that's been a good look at the HSL key and the associated controls. By now you've downloaded quite a few things to play around and practice with. So go and play around with this tool, see what you can do. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. In this video, we're going to look at the color slice tools. We'll keep it basic for now and focus on the main functions. These are a powerful set of secondary tools that allow us to quickly work on pre-qualified ranges of hue, so red, yellow, green, etc., and change the hue and saturation of the qualified pixels. Now, this is not dissimilar to the 6-vector color targets we have on the hue attribute curves. For example, this red dot here means I can choose red and very quickly work on the red hues. But this raises a question. Why do we need another tool that does this? Don't the attribute curves already enable us to make quick adjustments to the reds or the yellows or anything else? Well, the answer is that the color slice uses a different method when working with saturation compared to the other tools that we've seen so far. The color slice works subtractively rather than additively. What does that mean? We'll take a look and find out. We've got some new practice footage here, and we'll go back to the previous stuff soon enough, but these shots will give you a better opportunity to practice with the color slice tools. I'd like to point out that these shots are ideal for the color slice. I find that it excels with brightly colored materials, such as fabric, plastics, metals, and what have you, so it gets plenty of use. We've got a simple challenge here. The hat, the jacket, and the skin tones need work. The client wants very strong, cartoony colors and nice, rich skin tones on the talent. So, let's start by taking the brief literally, starting with the hat. Now, I've already made a qualification on the hat here, and let's see what happens if we crank up the global saturation on the primaries window. I'm going to make sure I've got highlight on, and I want you to take a close look at the parade scopes in the lower right of the screen. As I drag my saturation up, see that the red wave keeps climbing higher and higher. This is an additive operation. We're increasing saturation by boosting the relevant color channels, and this makes our colors brighter as well as more saturated. And it looks wrong. It's too bright and it does not fit into the image. Now, I could try some convoluted stuff with the other primary tools here, and this is how I originally graded this project way back then. I could bring the highlights down, the mids down, the shadows down, preserve a bit more contrast within this region, and then dial the saturation back in. And then I might go into the secondary curves and try and bring a bit more saturation into these silvery highlights here and make the red a bit more of a flatter color. But let's not do that. Let's see what the color slice can do for us. Now I'm going to get rid of this secondary. In fact, I'm going to go onto an entirely different node, and I'm just going to deactivate the previous one. The color slice comes with its qualifications built in, and we have a limited capacity to refine them. We're going to look at the reds using the color slice, so first I want to check that qualification. Now I do this by clicking on any tool in the corresponding window, in this case the red window, and then activating highlight mode, and it will show me the key built in to the color slice, or the relevant part of the hue range down here. Now, this isn't great. It's got gaps, it hits a lot of stuff I don't want to work with, but we will get a usable qualification out of this. The only real option to refine this is the center bar, just below the vector scope icon down here. You'll notice that each of these circles has a highlighted section, like a pizza slice, and this shows us the hues that the corresponding tool will impact. There's also a white line, like a clock hand, and this is the center point of the qualification. Clicking and dragging the center bar will move this white line around. And you can see the impact this has on our qualification. In this case, dragging it all the way to the right will give us something that we can use. Now, we want to see what we can do with the saturation slider down below, the one with the raindrop icon. We can click and drag the icon left or right, we can click and drag up or down within the bar here, or we can double click on the number below and type something in. So, let's raise the saturation and see what happens. Look at our red wave on the parade. It's barely moving, but the green and the blue channels are falling. This is a subtractive operation. It does not increase the relevant channels to increase saturation. Instead, it decreases the other channels. So let's take a look at what effect this has on brightness. Let's go over to the waveform and let's increase the saturation. Contrary to the previous additive operation where increasing saturation made something brighter, in this case, it looks like increasing the saturation makes something darker. And decreasing the saturation will also make it brighter. Just something to be aware of when you're using this tool. Now, this immediately gives us a much better result. I'm just going to drag up, and in fact I'm going to take a look at this in the context of the actual image, and I can very quickly get a nice rich red hat that looks good and doesn't jar out of the rest of the image, especially once we do some work on the yellow jacket down here. So I might just wrangle this a little bit more, and I'm pretty happy with that. So the next task is the yellow jacket. So I've got another node for that. First, let's check the key on the yellow jacket. Let's make sure that it's the active window, and then activate highlight mode, and oh dear. Yellow and green are difficult. They're quite common in nature, and they have a lot of overlap. We can't use this key, and in fact, we won't be able to use anything that the yellow window does down here. If I drag it one way, I get the foliage. If I drag it the other way, I get the skin tones. And I just want to work on this jacket, so using the 6-vector kind of selection down here is not going to work. We're going to pull a traditional hue sat luma key for the jacket, which will be very easy. So I will just quickly do that. Okay, and that was easy enough. So now let's go back to the 6-vector. And if I hit the highlight mode, I'm still seeing the key for the yellow color slice down here. Now this gets a little bit confusing switching between different keys. We're going to use the global controls here, which will respect the hue sat luma key we've just pulled. To get rid of this display, I'm just going to hit the reset button. And now with none of these tools active, with them all at their default values, I'm not going to see any of those pre-made keys. I'm just going to see the key that I made with the HSL key. And we're going to use the global controls at the top of the window here. So now I know that I'm working within the correct qualification. I will just turn that off. So now, if I work with these global controls, you can see that I'm working within the HSL key that we've made. So I don't need to rely on these pre-made qualifications down here. And this will also respect the power windows as well. So we can make some very accurate qualifications and then make subtractive saturation adjustments within them. I'm just going to give the coat a bit of a boost. Keep going until it looks good. Not too much, but a little bit, and that's good. And it's also kind of filled out some of the silvery highlights on the left-hand side as well. So that was also very easy. I didn't have to faff around with any of the primaries down here. We fixed the jacket. Finally, we have the skin tones. We're going to look at the density slider here, and I found that it's quite good for darker skin tones. So what we'll do is we'll go and check our key because it might save us some time. I'm going to look at skin down here. Now, let's see what I can do. It looks like I'm either going to get the hat or the jacket, and I'm always going to get the basketball hoop, so I don't think we'll use the skin tools. We're going to have to pull another HSL key. That's okay, we're colorists, we are used to it by now. So give me a second whilst I do this. Okay, that's a decent key. I'm going to need to garbage map the hoop at the top, so I will do that very quickly. Go to the tracker and just do a track there. And make sure it's a negative shape. And there we go. So I've got a pretty decent, stable skin key here. I've got a little bit on the hat, I'm not too bothered about that. Maybe if this were for real, I'd go in and I'd maybe just track that out. That'd be quite easy on this shot. But for now, that's okay. Now, I think I also want to mat this guy out. On the left, he's going to need a bit of a different operation on his skin because his skin tones are very different. So I'll add another curve. I will track him out as well. because his lips will go funny if we work on the color slice there. And we will just make sure that that's also punching a hole in the mat. There we go. We've got our two kind of main leads in here, qualified. So let's see what we can do with our skin tones. Now, we'll take a look at density, as it can be quite helpful when working on skin under certain conditions. Density reduces the brightness of the most saturated pixels in our image. So if I drag it up, it brings the more colourful parts of the skin down, and you'll notice that it leaves our kind of neutral highlights alone, which makes it quite a powerful tool. Now, if I drag density to the right, the saturated pixels get darker, and if I drag density to the left, the saturated pixels get lighter. So I'm going to drag density to the right until I like the look of the skin, and I don't want to be too heavy-handed here. I think that looks good. I might crank up the saturation a little bit. And just within our qualification, let's take a look at the vector scope. It's maybe a little bit south of the eye line here. So there's a global hue, and I might just tilt it a little bit more towards red, very, very slightly, not too much. I think 0.08 is enough there. And let's maybe dial the saturation back down a little bit. There we go. And now, before and after, it's added some nice depth to the skin tones. I don't want to go too far with density. So 16 is probably okay for this shot. So before and after. Darker, richer, more color, more detail. I think it's done a very, very nice job there, and it was very, very quick and easy. It would be quite difficult to make those adjustments with just the primary wheels. We'd start making, some luma adjustments within the key, which is always difficult to do. Now, we can see how the color slice has done an excellent job of all this, and in a fraction of the time it took me with the original grading tools. So, you've downloaded this clip, but also two others. We've got this nice wide here of all the guys dancing, and we've got this close-up of the lady here as well. So you've got some extra clips to practice on with the color slice. This wide in particular is a playground for this tool. We've got these nice greens, the reds, the blues, the skin tones, loads of things you can do with that. So have a good play around with this footage and get familiar with the color slice. There's a lot more to this tool, and we're going to look at some of the more advanced controls quickly in the next lecture. So click on through once you're ready. We're now going to look at the more advanced controls for the color slice. We're going to look at saturation and density depth. Now, I'm using a stock photo from Unsplash here, which I cannot redistribute, and credit goes to Cheng Feng for taking this image. The task here is to give the neon sign in the upper center of the image a hot, white core. Right now, it doesn't quite have the effect we expect of neon. I want the text to be white with a magenta glow all around it. And we're going to do this entirely within the color slice using the depth control settings. So first, we're just going to double check the qualification of the magenta color slice, and that looks pretty good. It's got the sign, and that's all I really want to affect here, so I'm pretty happy with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the saturation down. But the problem is this hits the wall as well, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to dial this in with the saturation depth control. I'm going to drag it to the right until I'm happy that I've got a nice pink glow, but more readable white text up here. So what just happened? The saturation depth controls how saturated a pixel needs to be before it is acted upon by our correction. When I drag the saturation depth up, it says I only want to work with pixels that are more saturated, and if I drag it down or to the left, less saturated. Doing this, I have preserved our darker, less saturated magenta values, and we're pretty close to what I want here. Next, I'll up the density to increase the readability of the text. Now this is hitting the wall, So just like with the sat depth, we have a density depth, which I'm going to drag up to a similar level. And that gets me what I want from this neon sign. The kind of soft glow on the wall is intact. The text is now more readable, and it looks more like a kind of neon sign. It has hit the signage of the food cart here. So what I'll do is I'll just make a garbage mat around the food cart. And there we're done with this particular correction. Now, these controls are difficult to use, primarily because you're never going to get close to 100% saturation on the majority of footage. The neon sign here is an extreme example. And unfortunately, the depth controls don't feel like they have the precision you might want to select, for example, skin highlights, and there's no control of the fall-off for the threshold set by the depth controls either. For these reasons, I occasionally use the depth controls on footage with practical lights, like this photo here, or nightclubs, city streets at night, those kinds of scenes. So we've now covered the color slice, and we're going to go back to the short sequence again. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. In this video, we're going to look at power windows, which are another tool we can use to make secondary qualifications, and we can even use them in combination with the qualifier from the previous video. So let's get started and take a look. First, I want to expose the controls for power windows, and we're going to keep working our way over to the right here. And the icon I want is this one, the circle with the 4 dots, which is the window icon. And this brings up the controls for the power windows. So let's go back to our demonstration shot. Now, I've got an empty node here, which I'm going to use to demonstrate exactly what power windows do. And then we'll take a look at using it in conjunction with a secondary key as what we call a garbage mat as well. So first, what we want to do is click on one of these icons down here to create a power window, and we have a few different types. We have a square, and this just creates a rectangle, or a linear power window, I should say, if I'm being correct. This creates a rectangular shape. Now I can click inside the shape, left click and drag to move it around. This little handle antennae thing lets me rotate it, and the black square inside the white dot is always the center point, is essentially the anchor point if you're familiar with After Effects. I can click on any of the white dots with a blue border to move either a side or a corner, and I can click on any of the white dots with a pink border to change the feather. Now let's look at exactly what a power window does. So a power window essentially draws a shape onto our frame, and then on this node everything we do takes place within the power window. So you can see here this kind of glowing pink correction that I've made happens only inside this rectangle, and I can bend the rectangle around to make different shapes, rotate it around, and you can see what it does. Now the feather is described by the 2 borders either side of the thick white line. You see we have 2 thinner white lines here, and we have our actual edge, the white line with the blue, well, the white and blue dots. The way the feather works is that at the outer extent it fades down to 0, and on the inner extent it fades up to 100%. So you can see it creates a kind of gradient effect where it fades off here. So this is the linear window. The linear window always has straight edges and 4 corners. I cannot get rid of a corner on a linear window, and we cannot stretch it in such a way that it overlaps itself. So fairly basic, and it has its uses. A lot of the time I use it for some basic vignetting, so the way I like to use a linear window, I'll just reset this, is I like to make a vignette that's actually quite big and quite faded. And when I'm vignette like this, I do like to try and find a diagonal line in the image that I can accentuate, so we can see in Wayne's stance here. There's a slight right-leaning diagonal, we could argue. If we look between the hand, the strap, and the eyes and the face down here, we have a kind of right-facing diagonal line. So I do like to accentuate that kind of sense of direction in a shot. And then what we can do is we can darken the edges of the image. Now by default, we work inside the box, which is not what we want for this correction. What I want to do is invert it, and I do that by clicking this icon here. And this inverts the selection now. I work outside of the box, not inside of it, and this is a very important thing to be aware of, because a lot of the time you're going to want to work outside of a selection or a qualification as well as inside of it. So now what I want to do is I want to bring my gamma and the gain down a little bit, and my shadows down a little bit, and what this does is it just closes things in and focuses in and makes Wayne the natural focus of this shot. Now it's a small and fairly subtle, in fact that one's not very subtle, so let me just make it a little more so. But these can be fairly subtle, but they're still quite effective, and all they do is they just focus the viewer in on the key parts of the image, in this case the main character. So that's how I would use the linear power window. I generally use it for vignetting. Next we have the oval, and this is probably the most commonly used one because it's used for tracking and grading faces. We'll go over tracking in the next video, but for now we'll just take a look at how we might use an oval power window. Generally we put it on top of a face, and now what we can do is we can just locally increase the contrast on the face, and that naturally draws our eye to it because the eye is naturally drawn to regions of high contrast. And so using power windows, using tracked shapes and windows, we can naturally create regions of exaggerated contrast that deliberately draw the eye, and we very commonly do this on a face because the actor's face is typically the most important thing in the frame. If we're working on a closer image, what we could actually do is go in even further, and I'll make yet another node, and we get loads of nodes in a real grade, so don't worry about seeing 5. What we can do, now if you don't see your power window despite having it active, in the lower left of your frame, go down here and make sure power window is selected. If you hit off, you will still see the effect of the shape, but you won't see the shape itself. Now you'll never see the shape when you render out, you'll just see the effect of the grade inside. So if you lose track of the shape, go down, power window, or if you want to get rid of the shape because it can be distracting, hit the Ghostbusters symbol here, hit off. And what we can do is what's called a raccoon eyes adjustment, and this is, and I kid you not, this is a real thing which we do quite a lot. I do this quite a lot on close-ups in particular. This is when we actually make a secondary adjustment around each eye on the subject in order to bring them out and make them a bit more obvious. We always have to track these. Now on this node, I can either make 2 nodes, one for each eye, but that's not a very good way of doing it. So I can add a second shape to the same node. I can actually have theoretically any number of shapes on a single node, and they'll all combine or exclude based on various settings that we can set up. If I want to add a second window, at the top of my power window interface here I have plus linear, plus circle, etc. I'm going to hit plus circle, and that's going to make a second circular power window which we can see down here. And now I just need to drag that, and I need to put that in place. And there I have my raccoon eyes adjustment. If I turn that off, what I can do is I can increase the mids and the highlights. I generally don't take the shadows down too much in eyes because the pupils can go a bit weird. And now That's a bit obvious. Let's... And I might just want to feather those out a little bit. Now if I want to change the effect, I can click and drag the feather on the outside, or on the right hand side here, I have the controls for my active window. Now the active window is the one with the dark grey bar. Breaking with Resolve's usual logic of anything you have selected is highlighted in orange. Orange denotes active windows on your node, and then the dark grey bar here is the one you have currently selected. It will also be highlighted up here. I'm just going to increase soft, and I'm going to do that for the other eye as well, because it's going to get rid of the hard edges that might give this away. So now, and I can take this down a little bit. I've got a pretty standard raccoon eyes adjustment that just brighten his eyes up a little bit and bring his eyes out. I keep talking about the most important thing in the frame. Well, for colours it's the skin tone, then it's the actor, then it's the actor's face, then in a close-up it's the actor's eyes. They are the single most expressive part of the face. They're the kind of emotional anchor that we read the most in order to identify emotional state. So the eyes are super important, and that's why the raccoon eyes adjustment is a thing with circular power windows. Now obviously they both need to be tracked. We're going to cover that in the next video. But those are the main use cases for the circular window, grading a face and grading eyes. Next we have the polygon window. Now the polygon window is a lot like the linear window in that it always has straight edges, and it starts out as a rectangle, but I can click on the line to add a point, and I can make a straight-edged shape with any number of corners. And this is the kind of paper star you put up in a corner shop whenever there's a sale on something, I guess. So this is the linear power window. I generally don't use it. I guess you can... If you want to, you can maybe draw around a face with it, and some people use it because it's a little bit faster than using the curve, which we'll cover in a second. I generally don't use it because the curve below does everything this can do and more, so it kind of seems a little superfluous to me, but it's still here, it's still a function and a tool. It starts with a completely hard-edged shape with no fall-off whatsoever. And that's not ideal. You don't want something with a really hard edge unless you're doing some very specific, very accurate stuff on something with a hard edge within the frame. So I've got my softness controls down here, and I have now got inside soft. And you can see that kind of blurs it on the inside, and outside soft, which blurs it outside. You never seem to properly see the softness indicators like you would on the linear window. You don't really see them on the polygon window, and for that reason I don't like it. For that reason I like the curve instead. So I'm going to get rid of this, and now we're going to look at easily the most powerful window, the curve. The curve is essentially the pen tool from Photoshop or After Effects. It lets us draw essentially any shape. It uses Bezier handles. If I click and I drag, I go from a straight line to a curve. And with this, I can really get very, very accurate qualifications and shapes. Once I've drawn a shape and it closes, it gets a center point, and then I can start to move things around. I can click anywhere on the line to add another point. If I hold Command or Control, I can click and drag the Bezier handles out of the point to create a curve, just like the pen tool in Photoshop. If you click on a point, it will expose any relevant handles. Then I don't need to hold Alt, but if I hold Control or Command, I can move just one Bezier handle. It is Control or Command in Resolve. It is not Alt to move Bezier handles like it is in After Effects or Photoshop. So Control or Command, and I can move one Bezier handle around. Now by default, it starts with a hard-edged shape. This time, the inside and outside soft will actually expose the inside and outside soft borders. Now these borders can become any independent shape you want. They're not defined entirely by the interior edge, including their Bezier handles. You can literally do anything with this shape. And so you can draw literally any two-dimensional shape with this tool, which makes it extremely powerful. Generally, it's used to mask out things which aren't an easy oval shape. A lot of the time you think you'll get away with an oval mask to get a face, only to find out that from a certain angle the face is a bit of a weird shape, and so then we have to draw around it with the curve instead. It can be used to garbage matte and isolate things out. So let's say I want to isolate something just very roughly here. Let's say I want to work on just the flower in the background here. And then I can see, okay, I might need to do a little bit of rotoscoping to fix that, but I can basically fix that. So I can isolate the flower, and now inside this shape what I can do is I can go into my secondary curves, hue versus saturation, choose my reds and my pinks, and I can make that flower brighter, and it only happens inside the shape. So now I don't need to worry about it hitting the hoodie or the skin tones. I can just do what's called a garbage matte. Well, that's not a garbage matte actually, but make a simple mask or a simple shape around something I want to work with, and now rather than going through the whole rigmarole of making a secondary qualification with the HSL qualifier, I can just draw this quick shape and use the curve. Same result, much faster. And this is where the skill comes in, is making those judgments. Do I need to go in to use the HSL qualifier? It's very time consuming to use, but typically produces the best results. Or can I get the same result with a combination of faster tools? Maybe the color warper in general, or the color warper and a power window, or a power window and a curve, or what have you. So this is the judgment call you're always making as a colorist, is what is the fastest way to produce the best result. So that is the curve window. We can actually animate the curve window to perform rotoscoping. We can animate it by hand and animate it around a shape. I'll show you how to do that in a later video. The final power window that I'm going to show you in this video is the gradient, and this is only for very stylized work. The gradient, basically, we have a flat panel and an arrow, and what happens is anything past the flat panel is 100% selected, and then from the flat panel center to the tip of the arrow is the gradient fade out. And I'll show you an easier way to understand this. If I go into highlight, highlight will also show us what we have qualified with a power window as well as the secondary qualifier. And so if I look at the black and white, you can see exactly what I mean. Anything on this side of the panel is white and therefore qualified. And then between the panel and the arrow, we have our gradient fading from white to black, and then anything out here is black and therefore no longer within the qualification. We don't work with it. And this is true of all of the shapes that we have here. They all just make a qualification that we can see with the highlight as well. So the last thing I want to show you is that we can in fact combine a secondary key with a power window, because these two things interact with each other. Let's say I want to try and remove, let's just see how he moves, that'll be easy enough. I want to remove the carp from this skin key because I only want to work on the skin of the actors here. So it's easier to do this working in highlight mode because I can see where the carp is. And what I want to do before I do this is just scrub through and see if any of the qualified skin goes in front of the carp I'm trying to garbage matte out. And it doesn't, so we're lucky here. I'm going to get the curve window because it's the most accurate, it's any shape I want it to be. And I'm just going to draw a shape around the thing I want to remove. And when I close the shape, you'll see now that my secondary qualification only takes place within this shape. And if I go back, I've lost my skin qualification. Now the reason I drew around the carp is because it's smaller than the rest of the image. Because what I can do now is, just like we did with the linear window before when we were making a vignette, is hit the invert button here, and boom. Now this shape has removed the carp from the key. It's removed the information we did not want to work with from our key. And nothing goes in front of it, so we don't need to worry about anything kind of going out of the correction here. That's fine. And now, nice healthy skin, but the fish hasn't gone bright orange in the background. So this is one of the most common things to use the curve for, is to garbage match things out of a secondary qualification, because you're never going to get rid of that carp and key out the skin. They're essentially the same color. So you have to use power windows to solve that problem. And that brings us back to this difficult shot here. What are we going to do about this? Well, we're going to do our best for a start. And now, either with the curve or with the oval, I'm going to choose the curve because it's going to do a better job of the neck down below. And we're going to have to animate and track this later on, which we'll cover in the next few videos. Now, we have our qualification that works on the skin tones but does not hit the wall. This is how we do it. This is how we solve this problem. And I'm going to tell you now, skin against red brick, or yellow brick in this case, is a killer. It's really, really hard to do because orange brick, red brick, and skin tones contain so much of the same color information. We are forever masking skin tones out of brick walls when we're doing this, especially in the UK where there's tons of red brick buildings. Okay, that we build with nothing but red brick over here, and so it's just a nightmare. So anything out on the British streets, anything out in a kind of British urban environment, there's a ton of this, because otherwise all of the walls go too bright, because red brick is quite colourful stuff. And it's something I am forever doing as a colourist, is masking skin tones out from the wall. Also, wood is the same. Wood and skin tones are very difficult to key out from each other. Certain kinds of exposed soil can also be very similar to skin tones as well, especially sandy soils. So it can be difficult to work around, and this is how we do it. So this has been a good overview of the power windows and a good use case for each of them. What we're going to do next is take a look at animation and tracking. So we'll take a look at tracking in the next video. So click on through to the next video once you're ready. So we can make some simple static power windows and work with static shapes, but of course the thing about film is that it tends to move around, or at least the image appears to be moving. So what we need to be able to do is to make our power windows move with the footage so that we can produce natural looking adjustments that maximize the impact of the shot, but that do not appear artificial or jarring. So that's what we're going to take a look at in this video. We're going to take a look at a simple use case for the planar tracker function in DaVinci Resolve. So we had our windows exposed beforehand. One to the right is what looks like a kind of very high-tech crosshair, or maybe a camera crosshair. This is the tracker controls. Now this isn't going to do anything if we don't have a shape active within this node. What I need to do is make a circular shape, and I want to vignette the face here because I want to add some contrast and some saturation to this face. I will bring things up a little bit, shadows down slightly, and when we increase the contrast we want to also increase the saturation a little bit, not too much, it would be silly. But until we think we've got a natural, convincing look that still draws the eye. And we can see a fairly simple, still looks fairly good. I might bring the highlights down a smidge. And because that then increases the contrast of the face and makes it a bit brighter, naturally draws the eye in, and it's just something that we do. a lot in the grade. Well, for good reason, because the face, like I said, is really important in this frame. It's what's telling the story. The face is what's conveying the emotions of the actress. It's the most important thing in the frame. So I'll bring my shape or my shape wireframe back up. Again, this icon in the lower left, power window, to expose it again. And if I play this shot, we can kind of get away with it for the most part, but then the left-hand side starts to fade out. And if we look, we can just about see the left-hand part of the face becoming darker as the actress moves out of the window we've placed. So what we need to do is we need to stick this shape to the actress's face so that it moves with her, essentially. And that's exactly what we're going to do with the planar tracker. So I've got my power window active. Now the power window we currently have active here is the one we're going to track in the next window, or in the next workspace. I will open up the tracker by hitting the crosshair, and now here are the tracker controls. So there's a lot of buttons here, and we're going to keep it fairly simple, honestly. What we're going to do is we're going to look at these. So we have track one frame reverse, track reverse, stop tracking, track both directions, track forwards, track one frame forwards. Now this is a very simple shot. It's a very high contrast area we want to track. It's very limited movement and it's never obstructed. So this is about as easy as it gets for tracking, which is why I've chosen this for demonstration purposes. If we just hit the track forwards icon, boom. And it's a more or less perfect track. You see how that moves with the actress almost perfectly. So the way the planar tracker works is that it places clouds of tracking points around regions of high contrast within a shape, inside a shape. It's basically, if I hit the tracking button again, you can see, if I go into interactive mode, don't worry about that, that it basically tracks things inside of the shape and this little blue bounding box. If we connect all the corners, if we imagine a box here, and all of these little things are tracking points. They're points of high contrast that the shape is following. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole interactive mode and removing, adding these manually. You don't need that right now. But that just shows you what the tracker is doing. It's tracking around the eyebrows, around the nose, the nostril, around the corners of the mouth, and it's kind of identifying planes and clouds of texture which it can track throughout the image. Faces are ideal because they've got a lot of high contrast features. So now, our shape moves. And anything we do happens inside our moving shape. And that is a simple track. It's really that easy. Now, this was a track forwards, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this. We don't have to track forwards. In fact, very often it's not a good idea to track forwards. What we sometimes want to do is we want to find the frame that gives us the best, most unobstructed view of the subject we're tracking, and that's probably not the start of the shot in a lot of cases. So what we can do is we can drag it forwards, or we can drag our playhead forwards, position the shape, and then we can track reverse, track forwards, or we can hit track reverse and forwards, and it'll do all of it for us. Now, sometimes we may run into a problem, in which case if we see the window behaving strangely, we can hit the pause button and it will stop tracking before it goes off and sails off into the distance and starts to behave all weird. Or, if we really are having a hard time of it, we can track one frame at a time, and on challenging shots, that can be a good way to get through difficult parts of the shot. So we just hit track one frame forwards, and go, and go, and go, and you see it lays down a load of tracking points when it does it this way. Because it knows if you're tracking one frame at a time, you've got a reason to be doing that, and that reason's going to be the other tracks aren't going to work. And then when we're more confident and we've gotten through the difficult bit, we can then just say, yeah, go on, track forwards. Then we can drag it back and say, track backwards. So we've got all kinds of controls that we can use to perform our track. And this is essentially it. For the basic shots, this is essentially it. Now, most shots aren't this basic, so let's take a look at a more difficult shot. Let's take a look at how the track has worked here. Good so far. Oh dear. When we get to the end, look at all of this. The wall's going to be hit by this if I do anything in here. What we get is a halo. And that then becomes really, really obvious at that point. So we need to fix this track. Unfortunately, the basic controls that we've just covered don't give us the control required to fix this track. So we're going to have to take a look at how to manually keyframe to solve a problematic track, which we will do in the next video. So first, take a look at this shot, this shot. This shot can be interesting, the hands can get in the way. This shot is obstructed, so when we match our short sequence later on, we'll take a look at how to deal with an obstruction. And in this shot, they're in profile. So take a look at these two shots and have a go with some very simple tracking. And once you're familiar with this, click on through to the next lecture when you're ready. Okay, so in this video, we're going to take a look at keyframing and how to use keyframing to fix a track which has gone wrong. So we're going to solve this problem when the vignette goes off the face when she moves from side to side. But first, let's take a quick look at keyframing and how to do it within Resolve. There are two key ways of doing this. The first is to use the keyframing window, which in the lower right, there is an icon that looks like 3 blurred diamonds. We left click that, and this will expand the keyframing interface in the lower right. Now we've got a row for each of our correctors. I'm on number 3, so I'm going to expand corrector number 3. We get a great big list of different things that we can animate and keyframe. So for demonstration purposes, I am going to make a circular window, and because pink is always very visible, we'll make it magenta, and I will keyframe this window to move across the screen. So first off, we need to enable keyframing for the right thing. Down here we have this great big list: linear win for window, circular window, polygon window, power curve, which is the curve down here, gradient color corrector, which is pretty much all of our color tools from the wheels to the curves, qualifier, which is the HSL key, misc isolation, defocus, noise reduction, open effects, node format, what have you. So I want to move my circular window around, and this is one of the most common things to animate our windows. I want to hit the grey diamond here. This is just like the time vary stopwatch in Adobe. It activates keyframing, but it does not place a first keyframe down. Now, if I change anything with this window, it's going to place a diamond keyframe down on the timeline in the correct row for the circular window. Then I can keyframe just like I would in any other software, move the playhead, change something, and now we get animation which plays back. Very, very simple, very, very basic. So this is the most basic way to keyframe. We can also right-click and choose Add a Static or a Dynamic Keyframe. A dynamic keyframe is what you recognize as just a normal keyframe in Adobe. A static keyframe is a hold keyframe. So if I place two static keyframes down, what you get is that they don't fade between each other. They suddenly just jump as you hit the keyframe, whereas dynamics will interpolate between each two and produce animation. So that's the basics of how these keyframes down here work. It's a lot like working in After Effects. You can just click and drag and then turn them off. Then I can deactivate my keyframing. If I deactivate the keyframe diamond here, it does not delete all of my keyframes. It's not like Adobe. I can place keyframes down, and then when I turn keyframing off, they're still there. Whereas if you uncheck the time vary stopwatch in Adobe, all of your keyframes for that attribute will be deleted. So resolve is a bit different there. I can also keyframe all kinds of things. If I get rid of my window, I can keyframe the color corrector, and this is basically all of my tools. So what I can do is I can start pink, and I can keyframe to change the color over time, and that will actually just animate between colors. This is, again, it's another situational tool, very, very useful when you face changing light conditions, such as if you're shooting externally and a cloud goes over the sun. If you're shooting a shot where you walk from indoors to outdoors, or you walk from one form of lighting to another, or if you have to deal with fluorescent lighting, club lighting, any kind of changing lighting conditions, essentially. Or if the camera moves from a darker part of the set to a lighter part of the set, if the lighting's not super even, then you want to keyframe your grade to keep the shot consistent throughout. And this is how you do that. You'll see examples of this in the industry projects later on in the course. But that's the basics of how keyframes are applied outside of the tracker. But the whole point of this is to fix this problem. How do we stop the power window from going off target when she moves her face from side to side? We're going to do this entirely within the tracker interface. We're going to do all of our keyframing within the tracker interface because it's the cleanest, tidiest, easiest way to do this. And it does mean that we don't accidentally get two sets of competing keyframes, which can cause a lot of confusion with new users. So, if we want to start animating anything within our track, we need to change from clip mode to frame mode. Now if I go to frame mode and I move or change anything, it will automatically place a keyframe down in the timeline of the tracker. But notice, not in the row for circular window in our keyframe window. Now this really confuses a lot of new users. We have our keyframes in the keyframe window, and we have a separate set of keyframes in the tracker window. And they can fight with each other if we use both. So stick to one. Okay? It's okay to keyframe your color corrector and then use the tracker to move your shapes, but if you keyframe the shapes in your tracker and in your keyframe window, you're going to get all kinds of weird wrenching distortion effects. It's going to get weird and you're not going to be sure why it's going wrong. So stick to this method for moving power windows around which are tracked. Okay? Otherwise, it's going to go all kinds of wrong. So, what I want to do is I want to look at the graph I've got down here and identify when my power window begins to drift away from its intended position. And that's actually very easy to do. Generally, deviation from the intended motion path coincides with peaks and troughs in our graph. And here we can see we've got a peak and a plateau that comes up here, where the yellow line peaks, and then there's a plateau in the yellow and green lines. These typically show us when our shape has reached a point of maximum deviation. So if I go from the start of this slope to the peak, then I move the window back and adjust the shape. Now what you will see is that that manual animation is compensating for the deviation from our track, or the track's deviation from the intended position, I should say. And again, this will not work unless you are in frame mode on the tracker. You can tell you're in frame mode because your anchor point goes red. So now, I need to go ahead. Now what we're getting is a weird wrenching effect because whenever you start a track or finish a track, Resolve places a keyframe down automatically. You can see we have a diamond at the end right here. And this is a keyframe, and our shape is going to try, well, our shape is going to go into that shape at the end of the timeline. Now if I start moving things around, what you'll see is a lot of very extreme movement towards the end as it goes towards that final keyframe. So before I get too far along in doing this, I really need to go to the end of my track and I need to make sure that this final keyframe ends in a good position and with a good shape. That way I'm more or less always working towards like the right end result with this. And this used to drive me bananas. I used to not know about this, and I would do all of my keyframing in the keyframing window, and because this last keyframe was here, it used to be like I would honestly go like frame by frame and the shape would just jump off and I didn't know what was happening, and it's because of this. It's because this keyframe was already here and the animation was fighting between the two sets of keyframes. So now this is in the right shape. I can go back to where it might deviate again, and it's probably about here. And then I just move to compensate again. And now I've got a track which I have manually fixed. There's a little bit of overlap in here, so I can maybe pull that back. But generally I don't like to put too many keyframes too close together because it gives the window a very unnatural to kind of jerky movement, and that can give us away if we're not careful. So now I've fixed the track with manual keyframes. They only appear in the tracker, they don't appear in the keyframe window. This is where a lot of people can trip up, so as long as you're aware of this, you're not going to reach a point where your window is just dancing around and being all weird. Now I want to go back to clip, and we can watch it through. And now we've fixed a track that was going wrong. And you'll be doing a lot of this. This is a very, very common process within Resolve. Now that we've keyframed our tracker window, we can freely change the grade inside. They're two separate attributes. They're not bound to each other. So I don't have to stop changing the grade. I can do whatever I want with the grade, and it will happen, it will only be visible within the secondary qualification defined by the power window, which makes it extremely powerful. So I don't need to finalize my grade before I do any of this animation. So there we have it. We have our simple keyframing and an example of keyframing within the tracker to fix a problematic track. You're going to see this a lot in the industry projects further on in the course. You'll have plenty of time and opportunity to practice doing this because it's a very important skill. So with that in hand, click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now that we've covered qualifications, it's about time that we went over alpha, what it is and how it fits into our tree. Put simply, alpha is a channel separate from red, green and blue that dictates how visible or transparent a particular pixel is. If a pixel has an alpha value of 0, then regardless of its colour, it will not show up at all. It will be transparent and therefore not visible. Any pixel outside of a qualification has an alpha value of 0. That's why we don't see the adjustment made on any pixel outside of the qualification made with the qualifier or the power windows. For example, only the face is going green here. The pixels outside of our qualification are essentially transparent within that node, and therefore not affected, and do not show up in our final image. One extremely powerful thing in Resolve is the ability to combine alpha channels. We can make a qualification in the qualifier and then make a power window to further refine that qualification, which is what we did previously. This is called a garbage matte, and when keying a green screen, this kind of key combining, as it's called, can lead to extremely precise qualifications. We'll go over some examples of this in this exercise, and then we will go on to our real-world projects where we're going to do a lot more with this. For the time being, we're going to do a bit of a basic introduction. So first off, how to read alpha and your node tree. So we have our basic green dots, triangles and squares up here denoting our R, G, B inputs and outputs. And we also have some blue ones. We have some blue triangles and some blue squares. The blue triangle is an alpha input, and the blue square is an alpha output. Using these, we can carry our qualification forwards and use them as keys. This means we can use the qualification in one node and make another node that affects things outside of that qualification. So for example, in this shot, I've just wanted to qualify Wayne's skin tones, and I will reset this grade right here. Now that we've pulled this basic key, we can make an outside node with the keyboard shortcut Alt-O or Option-O. Alternatively, we can click on a node, right-click and choose Add Node, Add Outside, and that will do the same. Now notice that as well as the noodle going from our RGB output to the RGB input of the next node, we have a dotted line going from the alpha output of node 2 to the alpha input of node 3. And notice when I take a look at the qualification on node 3, it's the exact opposite. It looks a little bit like something out of Smiling Friends at the moment. And this now allows me to make adjustments in this node around the skin tones. The benefit of doing this is that I can now work on the skin tones in one node. I can warm them up, make them a bit more appealing. And then in the very next node, I can make it so that everything outside of those is very cartoony and bright and saturated, but it does not ruin his skin tones. Remember, skin tones look very strange very quickly if we go overboard. So this is a good use case for the outside node, and it's very, very commonly used in all kinds of stylized looks. We build our looks around the skin tones. The skin tones are the most important colors in the image. This is a very basic form of working with alpha. We've taken a good look at preserving a single color, but for argument's sake, let's say that I want to preserve or isolate two colors. Let's say that in this image, I want to look at the blue in the background and also the red in the flower, in the graffiti back here. So I'm just going to delete these nodes. In fact, I will make a new node. Now, a single key isn't going to do this because blue and red are too far away from each other on the spectrum, and I'm going to get the purple shirt, which I don't want to do. For the sake of this demonstration, I want to isolate blue and I want to isolate red. So what can I do? First, I need to key out the blue. I need to key out the color that I need in this node. There we go. So the blue is very easy to key out, but I want to work with the green as well, and I want to work with the green on the same node. So what I'm going to have to do here is make our first branching node tree structure. Up until now, the node tree has just been a straight line. What I want to do is make a new node, and the easiest way to make an unconnected serial node is just to right-click in a blank space, Add Node, Corrector. Now I need to left-click on the output of node 2 and drag it to the input of the new node 4. Because if it doesn't receive an input, the node does not do anything. So, right-click, Add Node, Corrector. Once the corrector is here, you need to manually connect it to another node, whichever node is appropriate for what you want to do. Here, what I want to do is take the resulting image from this correction and key out the red in the flower. So I've connected it from this node, node 2, to the new node 4. Now within node 4, I want to key out the red of the flower. Very easy, distinctive colors, super easy to key out, which is of course why I picked them for this demonstration. Now I have two nodes with two separate keys, but how do I turn this into a single key combining two colors? Well, we use a new advanced form of node that we have not yet seen. I'm going to right-click, Add Node, Add Key Mixer Node. And this gives us this little rectangle here with two alpha inputs and one alpha output. I need to drag the squares, the alpha output, into the inputs of the key mixer node from both of the nodes whose keys I want to combine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two selections and combine them into one node so that one node is working within both of these qualifications. I now need to make a new corrector. add a corrector node, and I can just left click and drag this empty corrector node, serial node, onto the noodle. When it highlights yellow, I let go, and then boom, it's integrated into our line of nodes. And then I want to click and drag my output of my key mixer onto the input of the new node. Now, you may notice that the RGB output of node 4 is not going anywhere. That does not matter. As long as we have a continuous line from output to input somewhere, we get a final image. If I break this connector, we lose our grade because the output is not receiving all of this work. I need one continuous line through. The only purpose of node 4 is to generate the key for the red of the flower. We're not actually changing any colors within this node. Its only purpose is to generate that qualification, which we're using with the key combiner to make a qualification in this node, node 6, which we are now working within. So now, if I look at this qualification, lo and behold, I now have the blue and the red qualified. And within this one node, anything I do is applied to all of the qualified colors. I could maybe adjust my I/O a little bit here. In fact, I could. There we go. Change that qualification to make it just a little bit better on the red flower. And now, within this node, I can selectively saturate or desaturate those colors. If I was going for a very stylized, almost Sin City type look, I could build a number of complex qualifications around the colors that I want to work with. So that's how we combine two different alpha channels into one node. And this is actually an extremely useful technique. It's a very, very good one, so it's a good one to be aware of. And as we work through the real-world projects, you will see this being used on occasion. Combining keys and combining alpha is really powerful and lets you do some very, very advanced stuff, as I've hopefully shown. We're going to use this more and more in the real-world projects later on, but this has been a pretty good intro. So we're pretty close to putting all of this into practice on a corporate video. So what I want you to do is a little bit of practice with this. Just fiddle around with some footage that I've given you and go on through to the next lecture once you're ready. In older versions of Resolve, it used to be awkward to copy and paste only certain nodes as opposed to entire grades from clip to clip. Now it's much easier to do this, and what's more, it's much easier to control exactly which individual operations or attributes of each individual node we want to copy and paste as well. There are a few ways to do this, and it's quite a useful feature, so well worth getting familiar with. The first thing you need to know about copying and pasting nodes is that doing so does not create a new node in our node tree. It overwrites the node we currently have active, the node with the orange border in our node tree. So I'm going to copy a node from another shot. This node here with the vignette on Wayne's face. Control or Command and C to copy the node and its contents to our clipboard. And I'll paste this onto this node tree here, which is just Command or Control and V and paste. You see I've overwritten the currently active node, which I did not want to do. So we'll go over that in a second. It is important that first we create an empty serial node to hold these pasted attributes. That way we won't accidentally overwrite any of our own work. After that, it's as simple as you might suspect. So Alt or Option and S create new serial node, Control or Command and V, paste copied node attributes into new node. So just to recap, I will do this again. We can go to any shot and choose any node we like. Let's choose the vignette this time. Control or Command and C to copy the node and its contents to our clipboard. Navigate to another shot, Alt and S, make sure we have an empty serial node that can receive the pasted attributes, and then with the correct node highlighted in our node tree, Control or Command and V. And that's all we have to do to copy and paste a node across two shots. In a lot of cases, everything from the previous node is exactly what we want, but we can also choose to paste only certain attributes into our currently active node. So I'm going to reset this node. There we go. Now, if we only want to copy certain functions of a node over, we also have a way to do that. What we have to do is select our serial node and then hold either Option or Alt and hit V instead. This will open the Paste Attributes window, and it's here that I can choose each of the attributes I want to carry over to this new node. And in this case, I don't want any actual grading, I just want the vignette. I just want the power window. In here, I'm going to choose the linear window because it's what I use to make the vignette. And I will then hit Apply. Now we have the vignette, but none of the grading came with it. So what I can now do is my own vignette grade in this shot. And now I'm going to take out this purple because we don't really want the purple. That was just for demonstration purposes. So now I can do my own vignette grade within the shape I pasted from another node. And that's good because the lighting between the two shots is slightly different. You know, it's a different time of day. It was 20 minutes, half an hour later. The light changed a little bit, ergo a slightly different grade is justified here. This is quite useful as earlier versions of Resolve required us to do this using a workaround that involved the stills gallery and the append node graph function, which is quite awkward. Now there's another way of copying nodes across as well, and I'm going to cover that whilst we're here. If I right-click on a thumbnail within the stills gallery, I can choose the Display Node Graph option. Then I will see the node tree for that particular source, and just to demonstrate, this can also work on shots within the timeline as well. Display node graph. There we go. I can now see the grade of a different shot in the timeline or in the stills gallery. So I'll go back to my stills gallery. Display node graph. So if I want to take a node from this tree and add it to my current shot, all I need to do is left click and drag. And as long as I drop it onto the noodle, it will then add itself in there and integrate itself into my grade. And as you've just seen, doing it this way will create a new node. It will not overwrite anything. So now you can see that I've literally just picked up a node from a previous shot and added it to my current shot, which is a very, very useful feature. So this has been a good overview of the copy and paste features within Resolve, and we will use this throughout the real-world projects as well. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We're going to take a look at the Magic Mask 2.0 in this video. This is an AI-driven qualification tool that represents a generational step forwards compared to the original Magic Mask. This tool is used to select contiguous regions of color, rather like the Magic Wand's default settings in Photoshop, but for the moving image. Now, if any mention of the Magic Wand makes you roll your eyes, don't be so hasty. The Magic Mask 2.0 is actually quite an improvement over the previous version and has some genuinely good use cases, albeit with a few caveats. The first use case of which is to generate a usable secondary key, and that is what we are going to do in this video. Now, we're familiar with the short sequence by now. We've got this shot and we want to key out the skin of the actress, but we already know we have a problem. The wall is the same color as the skin and is almost impossible to exclude from the key whilst adequately keying out the skin tones of the actress. I've also lost the shadows under the neck here as well. Remember I said that Magic Mask 2 qualifies contiguous regions of color. That means that if there's any division between the qualified region of color, the face, for example, and the background, then the Magic Mask will only select the face. For example, it's not going to cross over the shadow and the hoodie here into the wall in order to qualify the wall. It will find the edges of the shape and it will stay within them. So on paper, the Magic Mask should easily and quickly allow us to qualify the skin tones of the actress and not also get the wall in this shot. This is one of the main use cases I have for Magic Mask 2 since its release. It's making it much easier to qualify skin out against similarly coloured backgrounds like red brick, timber, or exposed earth. It also does a good job of preventing hair from being included in the skin key, which was always a common problem before, and resulted in a lot of additional garbage matting. So let's take a closer look at this process. On this image, I want to key out the skin. Obviously, we've already done this, but this time, just because I say so, we cannot use any power windows and we have to use the magic mask instead. So I'm going to select Correct Node and expand the viewer. We'll open the interface and take a look. So the icon we want is this little person here in a frame against a checkered background. And this is the Magic Mask 2 interface. It's quite similar to the tracker interface. Now, if you're familiar with After Effects, I urge you to resist any comparison you may make with the Roto brush. They're not as similar as they first appear. What we want to do is place tracking markers down within the region we want to highlight. The Magic Mask then does its best to figure out what the boundaries of this region are and then computes a mask frame by frame as it tracks. I want to start and make sure that this additive pipette symbol is active here, and then I'm going to click on the forehead of the actress to place a tracking point. I've got my Show Mask Overlay toggled on. I will just turn that off for now. And now we will track forwards. Give it a second and it will do its thing. Now let's review the mask by clicking this double square icon on the upper right of the window. It will produce a mask overlay which is okay-ish at first, but we do need to do some work here. Let's scrub back and take a look. So that's not bad. We have some chattering problems around the edge. Earlier on we have a little issue with the ear here, some things that need to be smoothed out. Also, we have a very hard boundary between the hair and the skin that needs to be blurred out as well. So we wouldn't use this as a usable secondary key. We might use this as an element of a garbage mat when making a qualification and combining our secondary tools. So one thing I want to show you is that we can actually place any number of tracking points down that we want. So I might want to place another one down here on the neck or on the sternum. And then I can track forwards. Note that I've gone right back to the start of the clip again. If we want to add a new tracking point, to start with, click this button first. This is Go to Reference Frame. The reference frame is the frame that you placed your first tracking point down on, and that's kind of the origin point for your track. So we click this, and it will just jump back to where we are. I can then place my second tracking point, and then we can track forwards. And that's if I just wanted to stabilize the area of the neck. What I would not do is try and track the ear because it disappears. So we're going to have to try and refine that out later on. So we've taken a look at our mask. It's okay, but we need to deal with the chattering issues. So far, we've been in the default fast mode, mostly useful for making garbage mats to help with other keys, and typically doesn't produce a usable key stable enough to work within by itself. But we'll change the mode to better. Now, when we change from fast to better, we are going to have to redo our track again. If we make a big change, like place a new point down, or change from fast to better, or change the smart refine, more on that later, we have to track all over again. You'll see, however, in better that the boundary between the skin and the hair is much better. It looks much better around the ear. There might be a little bit of positive spill around the hoodie, but we can deal with that. So we'll track again. And this does take a lot of CPU power, but it's quite a powerful effect. Okay, so this is generally looking pretty good and stable. We've got a bit of false positive on the hoodie here. The ear's looking great there. The neck and the sternum's looking good. We've got chatter in here. And we've got chatter around the ear and in the neck shadow. So we have to do a bit of work here. Now, we can get lost twiddling all of the sliders down here, but what will make the biggest difference is Smart Refine. And in this case, we actually want to reduce it, not increase it. I find the default value can actually be a little heavy-handed, and in this case, setting it to 10 will go a long way. I'm not going to click and drag the slider because it will lag and jump all the way to one side. I'm going to click on 30, double-click on 30 and type in 10. This will really test the capability of your workstation. Now, if we change Smart Refine, we have to track again, and we should see that this has made quite an improvement So now there's still a bit of chatter, but it's not as bad as it was. We can use things like blur, denoise, etc. to fix this. So let's take a look at what we want to do down here. So I'm going to keep it to a light touch. I'm mostly going to blur, and the blur radius goes very, very high on this setting. It goes way higher than you'd ever need to use it. But a good healthy amount of blur. And I also want some denoise to help soothe the chatter down as well. And a bit of post filter just to soften it out some more. And we might just expand the IO ratio so we don't lose the edge of the face. So let's take a look at what that's doing now. So that's more stable than it was. We can add a bit of clean white, and we can clean black. And clean black will help get rid of the false positive in the halo down here. We might just want to put a bit more IO ratio out. Let's just take a look. So this is actually a pretty good key. Now, there is still chatter. It's not going to be perfect, because even the HSL key wouldn't get this perfectly. We just need to not be reckless with the adjustments we make within this mask. One of the things I do want to look at is the possibility of a halo around the forehead and nose when she turns her face as well. I'm going to check that, and we've got little bits of halo down here. We want to try and do something about the halo. Now, we can do something about this halo, though what we're about to do can become time-consuming. We have the option to paint onto our frame and adjust the key, but this is a frame-by-frame operation with no interpolation. We have to paint over every relevant frame. This is awkward, and using a brush with no interpolation easily produces chatter as opposed to a vector mask with clean interpolation of motion, which has cleaner edges. To use the brush tools, we want to click on this brush negative icon up here. This is the paint off, this is negative brush. And now we can scrub to where we have the halo. So around here is where it becomes most pronounced. And what I want to do, I can just left click to paint. And I can also hit this icon down here, change my brush size a little bit. There we go. And then I can go up here and I can actually paint and remove parts of the mask this way. And I'm just going to paint around the edges. And then I need to step forwards by a frame and do the same thing, wanting to be careful that I don't introduce chatter of my own. Now, a control surface with a graphics tablet makes this a lot easier and more intuitive. I want to focus mainly on the nose here and the base of the lip. And we're just going to do this for every frame. Like I said, probably a little bit faster than Roto. So now we have a workable key. I'm going to turn the review off. And I can carry out my correction within this qualification. And I don't want to be too heavy-handed here. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can do something about these silvery highlights on the skin. I'm going to add a bit of skin color to the face and then bring the overall saturation down. And that's just going to take those kind of silvery high reflection highlights off. And I might even go in here and just taking off splines for the time being, just very slightly bring those highlights down. So before, after, we might dial that back a little bit. And this just evens out the skin tone, gets rid of those silvery highlights. She's looking a little maybe overexposed here. And this is just evening out the skin tone. There we go. And just kind of addressing the exposure there. So simple skin tone adjustment just to bring highlights back under control. So this has been a good introduction to the new Magic Mask. In the next lecture, we will look at how to use this tool to generate garbage mats quickly and help us make detailed qualifications much faster in conjunction with our other secondary qualification tools. Click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We've used the Magic Mask to make a mostly workable skin key. Next, we'll see how it can help with what used to be extremely time-consuming roto tasks and garbage matting. Now, I want to preface this by saying that this tool does not replace rotoscoping as a skill. It is still important to be able to step in and take on a challenging shot manually if the Magic Mask is not able to bail you out, and it won't always be able to do that. So we're on this shot, and this is the shot where Wayne walks in front of the actress here. Quite a difficult shot to match to later shots in the sequence. We'll work on that more later on. I've got an old-fashioned face vignette here, which I've tracked to the dealer's face, and I've done some manual keyframing to compensate for the occlusion. And I've put a very slight but important contrast adjustment inside. What I want is to make sure that it's not also adding a circular shape that may be visible to some viewers when Wayne walks in front. So what we need to do is make a matte which is going to matte out the shape that we have on the face of the dealer, and we're going to use the Magic Mask to do that. What I will do is I will go before our face vignette. I'm going to make a new node. And I can, if I want to be fastidious, I can label this one and call this shirt matte. And now I'll scrub to a frame with a good view of the shirt and place a tracking marker. So we'll take a look here, go into our interface, and we're going to place a tracking marker. This time, the reference frame is not at the start of the clip, and it's important to keep a note of that in case we want to add any additional tracking markers later. Now I will hit the track forwards and backwards here. And now let's check out the mask. As per usual, in fast, it's got very hard edges. But it does work pretty well. I've got an issue with this kind of belt being a gap in the mask. I'm not too bothered about that for the sake of this demonstration. We just, add a little garbage mat to that for a few frames later on. So we need to refine this edge. But before we rush in, we have a challenge. Wayne's shoulder is closer to the camera and thus more out of focus here than this shoulder, which is further away and thus a little bit sharper, although still soft. So we have a problem. Our mask needs two levels of feather. Here it needs to be quite feathered and blurred, and here it needs to be less feathered. So we're going to have to do some keyframing. We already know how we can keyframe movement, so let's look at how we can use keyframes to manage almost any form of control we have within Resolve, and it's good for instances like this. I'm going to open up the keyframe control panel I have on the right hand side here, and I'm going to turn my mask overlay back on, and I want to scrub to where the most blurred part of the shoulder is, and we're going to dial the blur in here. So I'll start by opening the panel for corrector 3. We are on corrector number 3, we can see up here. Now it can be a bit of a guess as to where we should be placing our keyframes, as it's not as obvious as just using the power window track on this interface. The Magic Mask mask finesse controls lie within the qualifier track on the keyframe interface. So what I will do is I'll hit the orange diamond here, and I want to right click and I'll add my first dynamic keyframe. And now I want to dial in the blur radius and also the I/O ratio. Oops. Until I'm happy. And this is where a lot of heavy blur can really quite help us. So I can see that the pink gradient is up there in front of the face, and then I can just dial it in. And if you drag too much, it will lag and jump all at once. And dial the I/O radius back a little bit. And I'd say this is an appropriate level of blur for this point. So I've now got my keyframe and the correct blur. I want to scrub forwards. Again, I'm not bothered about the strap for the purposes of this demo. And I'm going to place another dynamic keyframe because I don't want it to gradually fade here. I want it to be a bit more of a sudden change. And then we're going to dial. It's a bit soft there. We're going to dial the blur radius back. And that's an appropriate level of blur for this part in the shot. I might push the IO out a little bit. Maybe not, and I can blur out. And that's a more appropriate level of blur. And now I've got a good amount of blur here. And if I click on this keyframe, you can see the values here. And when I click on the last keyframe, we can see the new values. I'm playing it through. That looks to be a pretty good mask. So now I've got the mask. What I can do is I can take the alpha output of this node, feed it into the alpha input of the face vignette. And then in the face vignette, I need to make sure that this is treated as a matte and not a mask. So I will go to my mask controls. So what I want to do here is click this button, which will invert the alpha received from the previous node. And now, when we check, lo and behold, we've got the face vignette masked out. Like I said, it does turn up with the strap. I'm not too bothered about that for this demo. And there we go. Easy garbage matting out of a face vignette, which did not take too long at all. This has been a good look at how to use the magic mask for garbage matting and how to use keyframes for attributes other than position. Click on, yeah. So let's keep going and click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay, here we are back on the Candy project again. So this time we're going to go through and do another pass, but we're going to be using our secondary tools here. So we're going to take a quick watch through and we're going to see if we can flag up some issues that need addressing. So let's take a look through. Okay, just here I've noticed that the shadows on this shot are a little bit cyan or green. You can see that this jacket should be black and it's a little bit bluey green. Same goes for areas of her hair as well. So we're going to have to deal with that at some point. That came as a result of trying to take care of some of the shadows in the purple shirt here, and it may have overshot and hit the jacket. We can fix that quite easily. We'll go through again. These maybe don't have quite the same shadowy contrast as this wide shot, so we can fix that and adjust that as well. Just looking back and forth between the two, maybe the walls here are slightly less saturated than on the wide. Okay, I like that shot. I think that's pretty good. I wouldn't change too much about that. In fact, I wouldn't even put a face vignette on this actor's face because he's got some quite nice model there, and the eyes are at risk of getting lost in some shadow because obviously this is natural light and it's above and it gives you kind of shadowy eye liner, kind of eye makeup type effects here because the shadow is cast by the ridges of the brow. So we're not going to increase the contrast of the face there. Maybe this part of the face is a little bit bright. We'll take a look at that and see if it's a problem, although it's not on screen for long. Okay, that's a little bit bright. Maybe that's a little bit washed out and lacking in contrast, and certainly the saturation's not quite the same. I think the shirt might be a good match, but the skin and the blue paint in the background isn't, so we'll come back to that later as well. These shots maybe need to be brought up, maybe a little bit more purple in the shirt. The shirt looks a bit blue here, and it's quite blue here, whereas it's more purple here, so we probably need to change that and make sure that it matches up. Okay, so let's go through and start tackling this, and we'll start with this shot here. This shot's alright, there's nothing that really leaps out. What we'll do is we'll get everything else up to scratch, then we'll come back to this one and make it fit in. So let's start with this shot. I should note that we're not using the master shot as a starting point anymore. Well, we are kind of, but we don't start with our secondaries on that one. I think I'm pretty happy with it. So I'm going to start on this shot, which needs the most obvious attention, which is to clean out the shadows in the girl's jacket here. So we'll make a new node, Alt and S, to make a new serial node. And what we'll do is we'll clean out the shadows, and we can do that with the Loom versus Sat curve. All we need to do is there, drag that down. Now if we take a look, it's maybe a little bit green, but there it was quite strongly green, and that's much better. So let's go back and see how that cuts with the others. What we'll do is we'll take a still here. In fact, I've already got a still on that one, my mistake. So that's now looking a pretty decent match. Maybe a little bit less. Now we've started to hit the face and everything here, so we don't want to do that. What we want to be careful of, especially when we're using the Lum versus Sat curve, is this kind of graphite charcoal style effect it can have on shadows. You can see there's a very kind of greyish, very charcoaly, almost kind of tactile illustrative look the shadows get when they're desaturated this way. That can work if that's what you're going for, but we tend to want to avoid that, especially on skin. It makes people look very ashen and very ill. So you can see now we have very grey patches of shadow on otherwise healthy looking skin, and it makes our actress look sick or maybe a little bit undead, and that's not typically a good look to go for. So we need to be careful with this. We need to exercise some restraint and try and get as close as we need to without actually interfering with the skin of our actress. Okay, we probably can't make that completely neutral with the Lum versus Sat curve alone. So let's see how a secondary is going to respond here. So blue, green, we'll clean black, and we'll clean white as well, blur it out. So now we can definitely desaturate this. Now there's a little bit of chatter over here. What we'll do is we'll just watch this through and make sure it's not actually visible. And it's definitely not. Okay, there's also no visible artifacts outside of that either. That's good. Right, so looking at the two, the colour's pretty good. Maybe this one's a little bit darker, so we can just go back into our primary node. And lift that up slightly. Okay, I'm quite happy with that there. So let's move on to anything else we want to do. I would say that I want to bring out the purple of the shirt a little bit more, so I'll use Hue versus Sat. And I'll make a selection around blue and magenta, which is where purple lies. And now you can see that we can bring it all out, or we can crank it right up. It's not going to go crazy. That's quite a big boost in saturation, but there we go. Just make sure we bring it out. We get those nice, crisp, cartoonish colours. Let me just check the I have a feeling that some of the shadows on the skin of our actress are a little bit green. Let's just check that with... Although really looking at it, I don't think so. Maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks on me. Okay, so we've fixed the jacket. And then we've brought out the shirt somewhat, so that looks good. I might be tempted to go around and add more, bring out some of the paint background, maybe fix the skin tones, but we'll keep it simple for now. I'd say those are the two things that I felt needed attention, was the jacket being the wrong colour and the shirt not being as nice as it could be. So now, these shots are simpler. I'd say all we really need to do is use Hue VSAT and bring out some saturation in the shirt here. What we will do is go back and get a still so we have a point of comparison. Okay, looking at it, I've got a slightly bluer shade of purple on the first shot. So let's go back to the first shot, get Hue v Hue, and we'll make the same selection here. And we'll just make sure that it's the same hue of purple. There we go, I think that's a pretty good match. So now, let's get that still again. And we'll check the purples we have here. That's a pretty good match. Maybe this one needs to be brought up a smidge more. Cool, we've got a few shadowy issues here, so what we can do is just bring down the saturation in the shadows a little bit without hitting everything else. And let's just make sure that we get this background wall consistent between the two shots as well. Okay, maybe go back here. We're going to add one more node, final set of primaries to bring everything back under control. And we just want to make sure that is more like it. Cool. Okay, I might be tempted to add a face vignette on the actress's face this time. She has less contrast because the way the light is falling has changed. So we can try and even that difference out a little bit. So what we can do is do a simple face vignette. Soften that down a little bit, then we'll track. Now this is going to need a bit of keyframing to fix it. That's all fine. So here is the problem. We'll go into our keyframing. We're on corrector 3. Circular window. We'll add a dynamic keyframe, and then we'll track ahead to where it deviates. So we find the point where the shape finishes its deviation, which is about there. Add another dynamic, and we'll drag that back, and now it stays there. There's a little bit more deviation there, so we'll just drag it back. We have automatic keyframing on, so we can just move things around. There we go, and then at the end, just make sure that it stays on track. Cool, now we make sure that we turn our keyframing off so we don't accidentally change anything. And now what we can do is just boost the contrast of her face slightly. Let's get a reference for the contrast of the face. I think I might go back and increase the saturation of the skin tones on this shot now that I see it. Let's see. I can probably cheat this. I'm going to combine a key and a shape here. It's going to be a big, imprecise, soft shape, which is alright. So it's there. Then what we will do is open up our keyframing once more. And add another keyframe. I haven't put automatic keyframing on this time, but when you add a keyframe on the top layer, you add a keyframe for absolutely everything. I have to make sure that I remove these from the color corrector because I don't want this grade to change, but everything else is okay. And I also want the... yeah, that's fine. If I had left that keyframe on the color corrector, then I would make my change here and then it would go back to normal again. And I don't want that. I want this grade to remain the same and the shape to change. So now that's pretty rough, but we're going to be using a secondary curve. We're going to be using UV set to only affect the yellows and reds, and because what occludes the shape is purple, that won't be affected by the red yellow secondary we're going to be making here. So UV set. Then let's just try and make sure that we get the skin in the right place. Okay, looking at the hue of the skin, she's a little bit redder in this shot, so we'll fix that as well. Very slight, maybe 2 or 3. Maybe a little bit less. That looks pretty good to me. Cool, so this angle this angle was going to need the most work because the lighting was so different from the others. Cool. And now what we can do, this is going to have all the same corrections as this one, so we can go wink, and we're going to have to redo the track here. So you can copy and paste a grade over, but you have to redo the track, otherwise it stays tracked to the old image, and that's obviously not very good if you copy it to a completely different shot. So what we do is we just redo the track, and that's a very simple one. So we've got a nice bit of focus on her face there. Nice bit of detail. Nice cartoony colours on the shirt. Cool, so I'm pretty happy with that angle now. I think they all match up quite nicely. So let's take a look at what we can do here. I think that's matching together quite nicely. The only thing I would really do here is bring up the purple on the shirt. I wouldn't bother with face vignettes, not normally in profile, but also not on a kind of a mid shot, slightly wider shot either, because we wouldn't really get the most out of it. If you put a lot of very, very high contrast detail in a very small space, it looks kind of busy and it's not great, so we typically don't want to kind of make detail too crunchy or too high contrast. So what we'll do is we'll just watch this through. I am pretty happy with most of that. I'm just going to bring up the purple shirt like I said, so we'll do that with the UV set. We'll make an adjustment around blue and magenta again, which is where purple lives. And we can bring that right up about here. Now let's get a new still here. We'll get rid of the old one. That looks like a pretty good match to me on the shirt there. Let's just take a look at the skin. The skin also looks like a good match, and the wall also looks like a good match. I'm very happy with that. Right, we're going to save. You never know when you can crash or have a power outage or any other nonsense that might interrupt your work. Okay, I'm happy with that one. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to put green flags on the shots that I'm currently very happy with. That way if I come back later I know what I'm doing. So this shot next. Once again, make a new node. And like I said before, we're dividing up our nodes based on the goals that we have. So in this shot, I've had a series of goals. I've had basic primary. I've got two nodes I have two nodes here tackling the saturation on the jacket, but that's because one is a curve and the other is a secondary. They both go together to make the same kind of, or to work towards the same goal. So I can just put them up there to show that and keep it organized. Then I've got the purple shirt. Then I've got a bit of another primary correction to keep things back under control. And then I've got the skin. So I've got this nicely divided up and organized into, goals that I have: primary, jacket secondary, shirt secondary, additional primary, skin secondary. And I know what I'm doing. We can give it a name. So if we really want to, and that's just by right-clicking and choosing node label, and then we know exactly what this node is doing. If you're working on a project with a number of people or more than one colorist, then this can be a good idea when it's necessary. A lot of colorists can just click through and turn a node off and see, oh, that's what you've done, and they know what you're doing. But in cases like this, where you're being quite specific, this can be helpful. Again, mostly appropriate when you're working in a group with multiple people working on the same project, multiple people contributing to the grade. It's not necessarily something you'd waste a lot of time doing if you're working solo. But it's a function that's there all the same. Okay, cool. So I am pretty happy with this. Okay, if I look really closely, I might feel like the purple on the left is a touch redder than the purple on the right. So you can click and drag these points. You can click and drag the value left and right, the hue rotate value left and right, or you can actually type numbers into it as well. I'm going to grab that. And the most accurate way to do this is to slowly drag the number, not to drag the point. And now I've got the same bluish hue of purple on both shots. I'm happy. I don't think his face needs any additional contrast or saturation. I think he's all right. I'm very happy with the blue and all the details of the paint back there. Only one thing bugs me slightly, which is this is a bit bright and looks a bit odd. So what I might do is a bit of basic digital relighting. Going to get the curve out and draw a big loose shape. We're not going to track it. We're going to draw a big loose shape, and then we're just going to feather it right out so that it doesn't appear too obvious. There's a balance in doing this, in being super hyper detailed and just getting it being loose enough and getting it in the right place. You don't want to waste a load of time rotoscoping if you can avoid it. You'll do a lot of rotoscoping in the grade, really. but there's a trick in finding when it's truly appropriate, and there's a trick in finding when you're trying to be too detailed. And that just comes with time. But here, and I might increase the saturation ever so slightly, but I'm just going to bring things down a bit here. I'll bring the scopes back up so I know what I'm doing. Okay. And that's just to bring the face down, because it's a little bit bright and distracting, just to bring that down a smidge and make sure that our focus is definitely on this actor, as he is clearly the focus of this shot. Got some really nice framing here, nice lower left third, upper right third. But all the same, even though she's technically in a focal point on this image, he is our focus, so I'm quite happy with that. Let's just check the skin tone. That looks pretty ideal to me. I think that's a very good match on the skin tone, so we're okay. So now onto this shot. This shot needs some work. May not have done the best, or may not have made the best decisions whilst making the primary grade. Actually, I think brightness it's okay. I think we need to up the saturation of both the shirt and the skin. Yeah, but that's an old still. What we'll do is we'll make sure we have up-to-date stills. In fact, I've been managing my stills very badly here. I'll make a new gallery of stills. This is second pass, kind of, now. And what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll take the stills we're going to use for comparison and put them in a new bin. That way we're not going to get confused and make comparisons with older clips or with older versions of the grade, like I was doing just then. So we'll keep organised. I need to listen to my own advice sometimes. Need to make sure you have image wipe on down here when you want to move your reference wipe around. Very easy mistake to make, to think, oh, I just don't want anything cluttering up the screen, I'll turn it off, and then obviously you can't move the reference wipe. And obviously we want the reference wipe and not the power window. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is take care of the shirt. In fact, I might leave that back up there so I know what I'm doing. UV set, and I'll make the same manual targeting I've made all the time. Okay, and get rid of those. If you have your eyedropper active, when you have a curve, a secondary curve active, it will then place targeting dots down for you if you click. I want image wipe because I want to move the image along. Yeah, I would say that's the same hue of purple. I wondered if the purple on this shot was a little bit red in comparison to the one on the right, but I think it's okay. Cool, now the next one is skin. Now we've got a few things that might interfere with a correction on the skin here. We've got this kind of yellow leopardy pattern in the background, and we have the pink in this flower. They shouldn't be too bad because they are also quite saturated in this angle and not as saturated here, so actually that plays to our advantage. We can correct everything at once. So let's bring up our reference and we'll make a red adjustment. And as we increase the red saturation, you see, there we go. We now have a pretty ideal match in skin tone there. That's a very nice match. What I might do on this is add a vignette to our actor's face. Maybe just get the contrast just so. The contrast's a little bit softer here. And then we're just going to track that forwards. And track that backwards again. So what we can do now, in fact, let's just check the end of that track, make sure it doesn't go too weird. Okay, we need to fix that at the end. Begins to deviate there. We'll do it the right way this time. Circular window. Now, there's a trick with fixing a track like this. A keyframe is automatically placed down right at the end of the track, but does not show up in this keyframe window here. It is super irritating. That means if we correct as we go along, it's always going to treat this keyframe here as though it's down here on this display, despite the fact it doesn't show up. So if I keep correcting as we go along, what we will find is that it will wrench back into that final shape, and you'll find that you just have to end up making frame by frame corrections to fix this. So after a certain point, what we do is we go right to the end and we adjust this final keyframe instead of placing like extreme daft corrections right down repeatedly. So we go right to the end and we'll fix that there. And now it should interpolate into that position for us, and it shouldn't require much in the way of fixing, maybe one just about here. That's fine. And then we'll turn off the keyframing on our circular window. And now we want to get back and we just want to get that nice bit of highlight detail there on his face to match. And I might actually use the log wheels here. So if I bring those highlights up, I'm also making them more red, so then I just need to push a little bit of blue cyan. And I'll bring up the scope so you know what I mean. If I bring this up, they get more saturated and brighter. I don't want them to be pink, I want them to be kind of white. They are highlights, and they're quite pale in the other one. So that's about right for brightness, but the wrong colour. So what I will do, they're a bit magenta, red, pink. I'll drag down, add a bit of greeny cyan in there, and now they are much more neutral. You want to be careful about making it look green. And that now brings that highlight detail back up on his face the way we have it in this other angle. Let's just make sure what we've got matches. Yeah, that's fine. There's something to watch out for, especially when you're working on faces, is that they're not all the same colour. The centre's often a little bit more red with more blood vessels flowing close to the surface than the sides. So he's more yellow tannish here and redder in the centre. That's normal. That can throw us on a close-up, especially if we're mousing over like this and we're thinking, oh, hang on a second, he's yellow here and he's red there. Here, well, actually, if I peel it back, I can see that he's yellow on the side as well. That's fine. That's a good match. But faces aren't the same colour all the way through. We tend to have yellower on the sides, redder in the centre. Cool. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that now that I go through. Now there's just these shots, and this shouldn't take too long. In fact, what I will do whilst I'm here, I will copy that grade across and put a green flag on it. I'm now happy with these two shots. I'll put a green flag on those. So I've got 3. That doesn't need a green flag, that's got nothing on it. That must have been because it was a missed edit and it's putting a green flag on both. I will leave that for now. Okay, so the only thing that really stands out to me here is that the skin's not as saturated as the skin is not as saturated as it could be, and the shirt is blue instead of purple. So make sure we go back to our primary wheels and not leave them on log. What we will do is I'll make a node for the skin, and I will deliberately bring that up. That's getting better. And now I will make a node for the blue and make it purple. First thing I'm going to want to do is change the hue. And that's more like it, that's very good. Now, same thing here, the skin's a bit silvery. So I will bring up the skin on this node. Make a red selection. Nope, make sure we make a selection in hue versus sat, not hue v hue. Common error, there we go. And now, new node, because we're working on the shirt. We could change the hue of the shirt and change the saturation of the skin on the same node, but that can be difficult to keep track of, so we're going to make sure that we stay organised. This isn't as blue as it was on the previous shot, so it's not going to need to be as big of an adjustment. Maybe a bit more. And maybe make sure that doesn't bleed over into red and start hitting the skin. We'll bring up the saturation of that here. Cool, there we go. Now that's okay, that thumb's a little bit undersaturated, so we'll just make another red and wang that up a little bit. There we go. Let's just check the hue of the skin. Nope, nice and orange and tan, that's fine. We'll just check that again. Tell you what we'll do, we'll make a still, and we'll just make sure that the skin hasn't changed colour suddenly. Might be looking a little bit pink on the left here, so maybe I'll just make a small adjustment there, go back to the skin key. This is why we didn't put our purple adjustment on the key intended for the skin, and we'll just drag that down, and I mean like maybe -2, very, very small adjustment. Maybe it needs a little bit more saturation. Okay, cool. Okay, now we'll just go back and make this shot fit in. Now it's pretty good. I think I might just bring up the green and the purple here. So I will make that familiar selection around blue and magenta and drag that up. And then green. Now, as I've said before, a lot of what we perceive as green is in the yellow part of the spectrum. There we go. There we've kept our nice cartoon, bright cartoon colour scheme. Right, we'll save again. And now let's watch the whole thing through, see what we think. And make sure that we take loop off. Right, I'm very happy with that. Might be a few little contrast things, maybe a little bit more contrast in the shadows on this shot. Again, this shot's always been a problem because it's been awkward. We'll go back to our second primary. We might just... there we go. A little bit more shadow contrast in there. Cool, I'm very happy with how that all edits together. Excellent, we'll save, and now we've done our second pass. So, hopefully we've learned a lot about how we approach matching with secondary tools. This is really when we get into the targeted nitty-gritty and accurate stuff. It's a lot of fun. You can get really lost in doing it. There's a skill in not just pouring hours and hours into one shot and wasting time. You have to kind of decide how far you can go and how practical it is given your time frame. Let's say we've got one day to finish a film that's about 8 minutes long. We're not going to have a load of rotoscoping because it'll take too long. We have to decide what we can do with the time we have. And we also, as demonstrated in this shot, we don't have to be super duper accurate all the time. Sometimes a bit of a broader stroke is just as good, or even better because it avoids hard edges here. Right, so we've got a little bit of technical stuff to cover. So we've got a little bit of technical stuff to cover, and then we're going to go on to the first real-world project. We're going to start grading properly. I hope you've enjoyed the course so far, and we're about to get into the real good stuff now, so click on through to the next lecture when you're ready.